Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet journey into the past. In tonight's episode, we'll drift back to the fading light of ancient Egypt, where Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, walked the line between love and power, and where empires shifted like the tide. Perhaps you're here as your thoughts begin to slow, or perhaps you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you found your way, I'm grateful. I often think about these stories traveling quietly across the world, reaching you wherever you are, at whatever hour of the day or night. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? If these soft wanderings through history bring you peace, I'd love for you to subscribe, so that many more gentle nights can follow. Tonight, let us begin with Cleopatra. You close your eyes and imagine Egypt, not in its golden age of pyramid building, but in its twilight years, some 2,000 years after Khufu raised his monumental tomb above the desert sands. The Egypt of Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh, was no longer the Egypt of colossal monuments being carved fresh from the bedrock. Instead, it was a kingdom layered with centuries of history, still rich in tradition and meaning, yet bound tightly by new rulers and the encroaching shadow of Rome. By the time Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, Egypt was not ruled by Egyptians at all, but by the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. They had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, importing their Greek language and customs, but adopting just enough of the old ways to keep the loyalty of their subjects. This mixture created a culture that was neither entirely Greek nor entirely Egyptian, but a hybrid kingdom where statues of Zeus might stand beside those of Isis, and where Greek philosophers walked streets that smelled of Nile fish, baked bread, and papyrus pulp. Cleopatra entered a world that was cosmopolitan yet unstable. At its heart was Alexandria, the capital city founded by Alexander the Great himself. By her time, it was one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean, second only to Rome. Alexandria's great harbor was filled with ships arriving from every corner of the known world, grain barges from the fertile Nile Delta, cedar wood from Lebanon, olive oil from Greece, and spices from further east. Each arrival meant taxation and careful record-keeping, for Egypt's wealth was its grain, and the Romans were already pressing for more of it. Alexandria was also home to the famous library and the Mouseion, where scholars studied astronomy, medicine, and history. But while such places carried the aura of greatness, Cleopatra's Egypt was more concerned with survival than with learning. The kingdom's treasury was heavily indebted to Rome, its grain exports often seized to settle political bargains. To the ordinary farmer, life meant tending to the flooding of the Nile, measuring out the rise of its waters on stone nilometers, and praying that the harvest would not fail. In the countryside, Egypt still looked much as it had for centuries. Mud brick villages clung to the riverbanks, their people living by the rhythms of planting and reaping. Farmers plowed with oxen, sowed barley and wheat, and prayed to the river gods for abundance. Taxes were paid in kind, grain stored in massive granaries that also fed the cities. This endless cycle of sowing and reaping underpinned the Ptolemaic throne. A poor harvest could mean riots, famine, or even the loss of political power. The Ptolemies, for all their Greek origins, styled themselves as pharaohs in the old Egyptian way. Cleopatra, like her ancestors, was depicted in temples wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. To the priesthood, she was a living embodiment of the goddess Isis. Yet, in her private palace, she spoke Greek, studied philosophy, and conversed with scholars in the Hellenistic tradition. It was this dual identity, half Greek ruler, half Egyptian goddess, that defined the kingdom she would one day inherit. Still, Egypt was not free to chart its own course. By the time of Cleopatra's birth, Rome had grown into a superpower, its legions spreading across the Mediterranean. The Ptolemies owed their very survival to Roman favor, and each generation of rulers had to send bribes, gifts, or political pledges to keep Rome from swallowing Egypt whole. The kingdom was both wealthy and vulnerable, a ripe fruit tempting to be plucked. To understand Cleopatra's story, you must first understand this fragile balance. She was born into a dynasty racked by intrigue, into a palace where siblings married siblings, and where rivals were often poisoned or strangled in the dark. She inherited a land still fertile and wealthy, but already slipping under the influence of a foreign empire. Her destiny would not be to expand Egypt's glory, but to delay its inevitable fall. And so we begin here, in the quiet streets of Alexandria, where Greek merchants tally their accounts by lamplight, where Egyptian priests chant hymns in shadowed temples, and where the great lighthouse of Pharaoh casts its beam over the harbor. This is the Egypt of Cleopatra's birth. Ancient, hybrid, indebted, and fragile. But what kind of family was it that ruled this kingdom? And what strange traditions shaped Cleopatra's earliest years? You may imagine when you think of a royal family, palaces, gardens, and carefully arranged ceremonies. But the dynasty Cleopatra was born into was not a family of peace or stability. It was the Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, and it was a family consumed by its own survival. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt, but their rule was shaped by habits that to us may seem strange, even unsettling. They married brothers to sisters, nieces to uncles, and cousins to cousins. This was not a matter of affection or romance, but of keeping power within the bloodline. To them, the union of siblings was a way of imitating the gods Isis and Osiris, who were believed to be divine brother and sister, husband and wife. To ordinary Egyptians, this blending of divinity and dynasty reinforced the idea that their rulers were more than human. But in practice, such customs bred mistrust, jealousy, and endless rivalries. The palace in Alexandria was not a place of harmony. It was a web of plots and counterplots, whispers in corridors, and rival siblings waiting for their chance to remove one another. Poisoned cups, daggers hidden in robes, and sudden disappearances were all too common. A Ptolemaic family gathering was never simply a family gathering. It was a stage where each person measured the ambitions of the other. Cleopatra's own family history was filled with such tensions. Her father, Ptolemy XII, known to the Alexandrians as Auletes, meaning the flute player, earned a reputation for indulgence and for heavy debts owed to Rome. To maintain his throne, he relied on bribes to Roman senators, selling Egypt's wealth piece by piece. His reign was unpopular, yet he clung to power through diplomacy and Rome's protection. Cleopatra, watching as a child, would have seen that a ruler's survival did not depend only on being loved by her people, but on navigating the larger game of international power. Inside the palace, Cleopatra received an education unlike that of most women of her time. The Ptolemies valued learning, and for rulers, education was a form of armor. She studied Greek literature and philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Most importantly, she studied languages. Unlike many of her ancestors, who spoke only Greek, Cleopatra was said to speak at least 9 tongues, including Egyptian. This was rare, for the Ptolemies usually ruled from above, communicating through Greek officials and translators. By speaking the language of her people, Cleopatra positioned herself as something unique, a ruler who could be both queen of the Greeks and pharaoh of the Egyptians. The palace itself was a city within a city. Its walls enclosed gardens filled with imported plants, aviaries of exotic birds, and pools where fish shimmered in the sunlight. There were scribes constantly at work, recording taxes, decrees, and royal proclamations on rolls of papyrus. Priests moved between the palace and temples, ensuring that the ruler's image was carved into stone walls, offering prayers and sacrifices in her name. To the common Egyptian, the queen might never be seen in person, yet her statues, her coins, and her sacred titles made her presence constant in daily life. Daily life for a young Cleopatra would have been filled with rituals. Each morning, attendants would prepare her with oils and perfumes, clothing her in fine linen or Greek-style garments, depending on the occasion. She would hear reports from tutors, learn hymns, study geometry, and practice oratory. Meals were taken with a mixture of Greek and Egyptian foods, bread, figs, honey, fish, and occasionally imported luxuries like pomegranates or dates. The palace kitchens were vast, and every dish that appeared on the queen's table was the product of hundreds of servants laboring unseen. But beneath this carefully ordered life was uncertainty. Cleopatra's family was fractured, her siblings potential rivals rather than companions. Each brother and sister was raised not only as a royal child but as a potential claimant to the throne. The Ptolemies had a history of brothers killing sisters, sisters poisoning brothers, and mothers conspiring against their own sons. For a child growing up in such an environment, trust was rare. Even affection was dangerous. Every gesture could be misinterpreted as a move in the struggle for power. One detail often overlooked is the way the Ptolemies used religion to reinforce their rule. While they were Greek by blood, they adopted the rituals of ancient Egyptian kingship. Each coronation involved processions to temples, offerings to the gods, and declarations carved in hieroglyphs. Cleopatra herself would later be hailed as the new Isis, the goddess of motherhood and magic. Such titles were not symbolic alone. They gave her legitimacy, binding her rule to traditions thousands of years old. For the Egyptian farmer in the Nile Valley, she was not merely a queen in a distant palace. She was a divine protector, connected to the rhythm of the river and the harvest. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, the court was a melting pot. Greek officials, Egyptian priests, Jewish scholars, and foreign envoys all mingled in its corridors. The city itself was diverse. Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, and merchants from as far as India walked its streets. For Cleopatra, mastering this complex society required not only intelligence but adaptability. She had to move easily between worlds, speaking to philosophers in Greek, to priests in Egyptian, and to traders in other languages when necessary. Yet even as she learned, the shadow of Rome grew larger. Her father's debts to Roman financiers, the constant presence of Roman envoys in Alexandria, and the knowledge that Rome's legions stood ready across the sea. All of this meant that Cleopatra's destiny was tied to forces beyond Egypt's borders. The Ptolemaic dynasty, with its strange marriages and constant feuds, was not merely a curiosity of history. It was a family struggling to hold power in a world that was changing, a world where Rome was beginning to dictate the fate of kingdoms. Cleopatra, as a young girl, was shaped by this unstable mixture. The traditions of the pharaohs, the politics of Greece, and the looming presence of Rome. It is easy to imagine her standing in the palace library, surrounded by scrolls, hearing the distant sounds of the harbor, the cries of sailors, the clatter of carts, the lowing of animals being unloaded. She would have known, even then, that Egypt's wealth lay in its grain, its river, and its position at the crossroads of trade. And she would have known that to survive, she would need more than beauty or ceremony. She would need skill, intelligence, and the ability to turn even love itself into a weapon. But what happens when such a child becomes a ruler? How does a girl raised in suspicion and rivalry step onto the throne of a kingdom already in decline? When you think of Cleopatra, you may imagine the powerful queen in her full maturity, meeting Julius Caesar or sailing with Mark Antony. But before she became that figure, she was a young girl growing into her role, shaped by rituals, by education, and by the very rhythm of Egyptian life. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, likely within the walls of the palace complex in Alexandria. By the time she reached adolescence, she was already part of the machinery of rulership. Unlike most girls of her age, who might have been concerned only with household duties or village traditions, Cleopatra's every step was part of a careful preparation for power. From her earliest years, she lived in an environment where ceremony and governance intertwined. The palace was not only her home but the center of administration for one of the most important kingdoms of the ancient world. Each day, she would have been exposed to the flow of scribes carrying scrolls, of priests arriving with ritual petitions, of envoys seeking audiences. To grow up in such a place was to grow up with constant awareness that the world's eyes, in some way, were always on Egypt. Education was at the heart of her coming of age. Tutors trained her in philosophy, literature, mathematics, and rhetoric. She read the works of Homer and learned the histories of Herodotus. But her most important lessons came in language. By her teenage years, she could converse not only in Greek, the tongue of her ancestors, but also in Egyptian, the language of her subjects. She may have spoken Hebrew, Aramaic, and Latin too. This ability set her apart. It meant she could speak directly to priests in temples along the Nile, or to foreign ambassadors without an interpreter. In a world where language was power, she was equipping herself with a tool sharper than any sword. Religious training was equally vital. From a young age, Cleopatra participated in rituals that bound her to the gods of Egypt. In ceremonies, she might appear in white linen, offering incense before statues of Isis and Osiris. She learned the chants, the symbols, and the gestures that connected her role as queen to thousands of years of pharaonic tradition. These rituals may have seemed repetitive and dull to an outsider, but to the Egyptians, they were proof that the gods still walked with their people. Her teenage years also introduced her to the responsibilities of governance. She learned about taxation, grain storage, and the Nile cycles. Each year, officials measured the floodwaters with precision, recording them on nilometers. A high flood meant abundance, while a poor one could mean famine. Cleopatra would have been instructed in how to respond to both, how to secure reserves, how to negotiate with grain merchants, how to reassure the people with ceremonies when the river seemed to fail them. These were not glamorous lessons, but they were essential for survival. Inside the palace, daily life mixed luxury with discipline. Cleopatra ate meals of bread, honey, olives, figs, and roasted meats. She wore garments of fine linen, often adorned with jewelry of gold and precious stones. Yet her days were not filled with leisure. They were filled with study, with ritual, and with listening to the debates of scholars and advisors. To be young in such an environment was to learn quickly that life was less about indulgence and more about preparation. Her family situation, however, was anything but stable. She had brothers and sisters who were not companions, but rivals. Each sibling represented a possible successor, a possible threat. Cleopatra's relationship with her sister Arsinoe and her brothers, especially Ptolemy XIII, would later define her struggles. Growing up in this atmosphere, she learned caution, patience, and the art of observing before acting. Outside the palace, Egypt was facing challenges. Rome's influence was growing stronger. Her father's debts to Roman lenders weighed heavily on the kingdom. Political unrest occasionally shook Alexandria. Even as Cleopatra studied her lessons, she was aware that Egypt's independence was fragile, that every decision her family made was tied to forces beyond their walls. One might imagine her as a teenager walking through the palace gardens. Around her, exotic plants bloomed, imported from across the empire. Birds sang in aviaries, and fountains cooled the air. Yet beyond the walls, she would know, farmers bent over their fields, sowing grain in the rich mud left by the Nile. Their labor sustained her family's throne. Their loyalty, fragile as it was, depended on her family's ability to protect the cycle of life. The contrast between luxury and vulnerability shaped her youth. She lived among scrolls and jewels, but also among debts and dangers. She was trained in ritual, but she was also trained in survival. Her coming of age was not marked by a single dramatic event, but by a slow accumulation of knowledge, of discipline, of awareness. Cleopatra grew into a young woman who understood that her future would be more than ceremony. She would need to act, to adapt, to endure. And so, by the time she reached her late teens, Cleopatra was ready, not fully, perhaps, for the throne itself, but for the life of constant vigilance and negotiation that it required. She was not yet the queen who would face Caesar and Antony, but the seeds of that queen were already planted. Still, one question remained. When the time came, would her careful education and rituals be enough to survive the storms that were already forming around her dynasty? When Cleopatra stepped into her late teenage years, Egypt was already showing cracks in its foundations. It was a land that looked outwardly rich and eternal, its temples still rising from the banks of the Nile, its fields still swelling with grain each harvest. But beneath that surface, the kingdom was fragile, burdened by debt, internal unrest, and the looming shadow of Rome. The lifeblood of Egypt was always the Nile. Each year, its floodwaters carried silt from the highlands of Africa, spreading fertility across the valley. But the Nile was never fully predictable. In some years, the flood was generous, filling canals, watering fields, and leaving behind fertile mud. In other years, the waters rose too little, leaving crops to wither, or too much, washing away homes and settlements. For centuries, The people of Egypt had accepted this uncertainty as part of life. Yet in Cleopatra's time, each bad flood carried heavier consequences. For Rome now depended on Egyptian grain. A poor harvest in the Nile Valley could ripple across the Mediterranean, sparking shortages in distant markets. This constant demand placed pressure on farmers. Taxes were collected in grain, stored in massive granaries that lined the Nile and the city of Alexandria. Officials measured, weighed, and sealed the harvest. Peasants might labor year-round only to see a large portion of their produce carried away on state barges. To the farmers, this system was as old as memory itself, yet in Cleopatra's generation, the burden grew heavier. The wealth of Egypt was feeding not only its own cities but also Rome's insatiable hunger. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had deepened the crisis. To secure his throne, he borrowed heavily from Roman financiers, draining Egypt's treasury. To the Alexandrians, he was a king who spent lavishly on festivals and bribes, while leaving the kingdom in debt. His nickname, Auletes, the flute player, was less a compliment than a criticism, a reminder that he was seen as a man of indulgence rather than strength. Cleopatra, growing up in his court, could not have missed the discontent that followed him. Graffiti scratched into walls and the quiet complaints of merchants in the markets revealed the people's resentment. In the countryside, unrest simmered. Bandits roamed the edges of the desert. Occasionally, villages refused to pay taxes, forcing officials to call in soldiers. These soldiers were often Greek mercenaries, not native Egyptians, which made them resented by the population. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled from above, but their grip was always precarious. For Cleopatra, watching as a young princess, it was a lesson in fragility. Power was not secured by monuments or ceremonies alone, but by the ability to manage unrest. The kingdom's dependence on trade also brought challenges. Alexandria's harbor was one of the busiest in the world, its lighthouse, the Great Pharos, guiding ships safely to port. Merchants arrived from Greece, Syria, and beyond, bringing wine, olive oil, timber, and slaves. In return, Egypt exported its grain, papyrus, and glassware. Each transaction meant revenue for the crown. But trade also meant entanglement. Rome's merchants and financiers grew ever more involved in Egypt's economy, binding the kingdom closer to Roman interests. Cleopatra, even before she ruled, would have seen that Egypt could not isolate itself. It was tied to Rome whether it wished to be or not. Within the palace, finances were a constant subject. Advisors spoke of debt, of tribute, of the need to appease Roman envoys. Cleopatra, as a princess nearing adulthood, was exposed to these discussions. She learned early that a ruler's task was not only to wear crowns and lead rituals, but also to balance accounts, negotiate debts, and make difficult decisions that often left no one satisfied. The grandeur of her palace life was built on the fragile calculations of tax collectors and grain officials. Religion, too, reflected the crisis. Temples remained active, their priests carrying out daily offerings and processions. Yet temple revenues had declined, siphoned into the royal treasury. Cleopatra's family needed the support of the priesthood, but they also needed the wealth of the temples. This constant push and pull created tension. Even as Cleopatra was hailed as the living embodiment of Isis, she must have known that behind the hymns and incense were negotiations, debts, and compromises. The people, however, continued with their daily lives. Farmers sowed fields, fishermen cast nets into the river, artisans carved statues, and children played in the courtyards of villages. Life continued much as it had for centuries, yet always under the weight of taxation and uncertainty. For most Egyptians, politics was distant, but its effects were real, in the amount of grain they could keep, in the soldiers they might see marching past, in the festivals that were less lavish than before. Cleopatra came of age in this environment, a world of ritual stability masking political fragility. By the time she was a young woman, she was already being positioned to share the throne with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. In name, they were to rule together. In practice, it meant conflict. For in the Ptolemaic tradition, a sibling was never merely a sibling. He was a rival. But before that rivalry took its full shape, Cleopatra would have absorbed the lessons of her father's reign. That debt could enslave a kingdom, that Rome's favor was both protection and a threat, and that survival often meant compromise. These were not glamorous lessons, but they were the foundation of her rule. And so, as she stepped into the first years of co-rule, Cleopatra did not inherit a kingdom of glory. She inherited a kingdom in crisis, rich in resources, yet bound in debt, ancient in tradition, yet fragile in practice. It was a land that could still feed the world, yet could not easily feed its own ambitions. The question that now hung over her was simple, but immense. Could she hold together a kingdom already strained to its limits, when even her own family seemed determined to tear it apart? When Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, died in 51 BCE, the fragile balance of Egypt shifted again. The kingdom, already weakened by debts and unrest, now faced a transition of power. By his will, Cleopatra was named co-ruler alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. She was about 18 years old, he was perhaps 10. On papyrus records, on coins, and in official decrees, they appeared together as joint sovereigns. But behind those formal images, the partnership was doomed from the start. The system of sibling co-rule had long been a feature of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was intended to preserve the bloodline and reinforce divine tradition. Brother and sister, ruling side by side, symbolized the divine pairings of Egyptian mythology. Yet in practice, it almost always led to rivalry. A brother might try to assert dominance with the backing of court officials. A sister might gather her own supporters, relying on her connections and skill. Sooner or later, one would seek to eliminate the other. Cleopatra entered her co-rule with an advantage. Though young, she was older than her brother, more educated, and already experienced in the routines of governance. She had sat beside her father in councils, learned to read grain reports, and spoken with envoys. Ptolemy XIII, in contrast, was a child surrounded by regents, guardians, and ambitious advisors. To rule in his name was, for them, an opportunity to expand their own power. At first, Cleopatra tried to assert herself as the senior ruler. Coins minted in her first years of reign carried her image alone, not her brother's. Decrees were issued under her authority. To the priests in the temples, she presented herself as the true pharaoh, the living Isis. It was a bold claim, and it made her enemies within the court. Those who had hoped to control the boy king saw Cleopatra as an obstacle. The palace became a place of tension. Behind its walls, factions formed. Advisors whispered in Ptolemy's ear, warning him that his sister sought to eclipse him. Supporters of Cleopatra pointed to her competence and maturity. The young king was too inexperienced to grasp the full weight of these rivalries. Yet his name became a banner for those who opposed his sister. In the city of Alexandria, the people watched. Markets still bustled with merchants and sailors, but rumors traveled quickly. Pamphlets, graffiti, and street talk reflected the struggle between the siblings. The Alexandrians had long been vocal in their opinions, unafraid to mock or criticize their rulers. Cleopatra had to balance not only her brother's faction but also the volatile mood of the capital. Beyond Alexandria, the Nile Valley continued its cycles. Farmers planted, harvested, and delivered grain to the granaries. Yet even in the countryside, the political struggle was felt. Tax collectors loyal to different factions competed for authority. Temples debated which royal names to carve into their inscriptions. Authority was no longer stable. It was contested. By 49 BCE, the struggle erupted into open conflict. Cleopatra's faction lost ground, and she was forced into exile. Accounts suggest she fled eastward, possibly to Syria, where she began raising her own army of mercenaries. For a queen, exile was not only a humiliation but also a dangerous gamble. Yet it showed her determination. Rather than accept defeat, Cleopatra prepared to fight her way back. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Ptolemy XII's advisors tightened their grip. They proclaimed the young king as sole ruler, presenting him as Egypt's rightful pharaoh. But in truth, he was a puppet. The real power lay with the regents and generals who acted in his name. They had little interest in the stability of Egypt itself. Their focus was on preserving their influence. The kingdom, however, could not remain isolated from the larger currents of history. At this very moment, Rome was descending into civil war. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, once allies, now clashed for control of the Republic. Their struggle would soon bring the Roman armies directly to Egypt's shores. And in that wider struggle, Cleopatra saw her chance. From exile, she prepared carefully. She recruited soldiers, gathered resources, and positioned herself to return. She must have known that her future did not depend only on her brother or her advisors, but on aligning herself with Rome's rising power. The dynasty had always leaned on Roman favor, and now Cleopatra would do the same, but in her own way. Inside the palace, Ptolemy XIII remained a child surrounded by men who used his name for their own advantage. Cleopatra, outside the palace, was becoming something else. A young woman forced to act independently, to negotiate, to command. The struggle between them was more than a family dispute. It was a contest for the survival of Egypt itself. The details of these years are not filled with drama in the way later stories are told. They are filled with the slow work of building alliances, the steady march of soldiers, the endless negotiations over debt and tribute. Yet in those details lay the shaping of Cleopatra's character. She learned that exile could be turned into opportunity, that defeat was not final, and that survival depended on patience as much as boldness. The sibling rivalry between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII was not only personal. It was symbolic of the greater fragility of Egypt. Two rulers, bound by tradition to rule together, tearing one another apart while Rome watched from across the sea. And so, as 48 BCE approached, the stage was set. Cleopatra in exile, gathering her strength. Ptolemy XIII in Alexandria, manipulated by his advisors. Egypt divided, fragile, waiting. The question was no longer whether the siblings could share power. That was already impossible. The question was which of them would find the strength and the allies to prevail. By the year 48 BCE, the political winds that swept through the Mediterranean carried with them storms greater than Egypt had faced in generations. The Roman Republic, vast and fractured, was no longer guided by compromise and shared rule. It was torn apart by civil war. Julius Caesar, a general who had conquered Gaul, marched against his former ally, Pompey the Great. Their armies clashed across Greece, and their conflict spilled outward, affecting every kingdom that depended on Rome's favor. Egypt, already weakened by the quarrel between Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, could not avoid the consequences. Rome was the creditor to whom Egypt owed vast sums. Rome was the arbiter who had decided the legitimacy of Cleopatra's father years before. Now Rome was divided, and whichever side Egypt supported could determine its future survival. When the Battle of Pharsalus was fought in 48 BCE, Caesar emerged the victor. Pompey fled across the Mediterranean, seeking refuge. He looked to Egypt, imagining that the kingdom where he had once been a patron might offer him safety. He underestimated the desperation of the Alexandrian court. For Ptolemy XII's advisors, Pompey's arrival was a dangerous problem. To welcome him might provoke Caesar's wrath. To deny him might seem dishonorable. They chose instead a grim compromise. They arranged his murder upon landing, hoping to win Caesar's gratitude. Pompey, once among the most powerful men in Rome, was betrayed the moment he stepped ashore, killed on the orders of those who sought to please the rising victor. When Caesar himself arrived days later, the Alexandrians presented him with Pompey's severed head. They expected approval, perhaps even reward. Instead, they encountered Caesar's anger. Whatever rivalry had existed between Caesar and Pompey, the Roman code of honor still demanded respect for a defeated foe. Caesar was disgusted by the treachery, and his distrust of Ptolemy's court deepened. At this very moment, Cleopatra was waiting in exile. She had watched events unfold, measured the balance of power, and understood what Pompey's death meant. If Caesar remained in Alexandria, Egypt's fate would be tied to him. Her chance had come. She needed to reach Caesar, and she needed to do so dramatically, in a way that would set her apart from her brother's circle. The story, told and retold by later writers, describes her daring entrance. Smuggled into Caesar's presence, hidden in a carpet or a linen sack, she was unrolled before him in the palace. It was a calculated act of theater, blending vulnerability with boldness. Whether the details are exact or embellished, the effect was undeniable. Cleopatra had secured a private audience with the most powerful man in the Roman world. To Caesar, the young queen offered more than personal charm. She represented legitimacy and continuity in a kingdom that was vital to Rome. Egypt's grain fed Rome's people. Its ports connected trade routes stretching from Africa to Asia. A stable Egypt meant a stable supply chain for the Republic. Caesar understood this, and Cleopatra knew he understood. Their alliance began swiftly. To the Alexandrian court, it was a shock. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors found themselves suddenly displaced. The balance of power had shifted in an instant, and Cleopatra had returned not as a fugitive, but as a partner of Rome's leader. Caesar declared that Cleopatra and her younger brother should rule together, honoring the will of their late father. Yet everyone knew this arrangement was only formal. The real authority rested with Cleopatra, supported by Caesar's legions. The months that followed were marked by conflict, both military and political. Ptolemy's faction resisted, sparking what would later be called the Alexandrian War. The city became a battlefield. Streets that once rang with the voices of merchants and philosophers were filled with the clash of swords. Fires consumed parts of the great library, though how much was lost remains uncertain. For ordinary Alexandrians, it was a time of chaos. Grain shipments were disrupted, markets closed, and daily life became entangled with the struggles of kings and conquerors. Through it all, Cleopatra remained at Caesar's side. She was no longer the exiled queen raising mercenaries in Syria. She was a sovereign negotiating her return, using her knowledge of Egyptian politics and her ability to present herself as both Egyptian pharaoh and Hellenistic monarch. Caesar, pragmatic and seasoned, found her a useful ally. For the people of Egypt, the outcome was uncertain. Some resented the presence of Roman soldiers in their city. Others saw Cleopatra's restoration as a chance for stability. Priests in the temples resumed carving her name alongside the gods, while artisans began to mint coins bearing her image. Step by step, she was reclaiming her throne. The struggle against Ptolemy XIII culminated in the Battle of the Nile. Caesar's forces, reinforced by allies, defeated the boy king's army. Ptolemy himself drowned in the river as he tried to escape. His body, weighed down by armor, vanished beneath the waters that had sustained Egypt for millennia. With his death, the path was clear. Cleopatra was restored as queen, now ruling alongside another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, though again, the partnership was symbolic. In reality, she held the reins of power, secured by Rome's support. For Caesar, Egypt was both a challenge and a respite. He lingered months longer than many in Rome thought wise, captivated by the city's wealth, its history, and perhaps by Cleopatra herself. The queen bore him a son, Caesarion, who to Egyptians was the heir of both pharaoh and Roman conqueror. To the Senate in Rome, however, the relationship was more controversial. Caesar already had enemies, and whispers of a foreign queen's influence did not help his position. Yet for Cleopatra, these months were transformative. She had returned from exile to reclaim her throne. She had demonstrated not only political resilience but also the ability to align herself with the greatest power of her age. Egypt was still fragile, its debts still vast, its future still uncertain. But for the moment, Cleopatra had secured her place. In the quiet corridors of the palace, where papyrus scrolls recorded decrees and messengers carried orders to the provinces, the reality was clear. Egypt was no longer independent in the way it once had been. Its queen owed her throne to Rome. And yet, within those constraints, Cleopatra found a way to assert her agency, to craft a vision of herself as both pharaoh of Egypt and partner of Caesar. The presence of Rome in Alexandria was not temporary. It marked the beginning of a deeper entanglement, one that would shape Cleopatra's reign until its final days. But in these first encounters, there was still uncertainty. Rome itself was not stable. Caesar faced enemies at home, and Egypt could not predict how long his support would last. And so, as the waters of the Nile once again carried grain to the ports, and as the people of Egypt returned to their rhythms of planting and harvesting, one question lingered. Had Cleopatra secured Egypt's future through her alliance with Caesar, or had she merely bound her kingdom to the fate of a man whose own survival was far from guaranteed? The months following Julius Caesar's arrival in Alexandria did not bring peace. Instead, they drew Egypt into the turbulence of Rome's civil war. What had begun as a dynastic dispute between Cleopatra and her younger brother now became something larger: the Alexandrian War, a struggle that would determine not only the throne of Egypt but also the balance of power between Rome and the East. At first, Caesar had come as an outsider, intending only to pursue Pompey and secure his own position. Yet the death of Pompey at Egyptian hands forced him into the affairs of the Ptolemies. When he sided with Cleopatra, he tied his fortunes to hers. This decision made him a participant, not an observer, in the struggle for Egypt's throne. The Alexandrian court, still loyal to Ptolemy XIII, resisted fiercely. Advisors, generals, and factions of Alexandrians saw Caesar not as a protector but as an invader. For them, his presence in the royal palace was an insult, a reminder of how entangled their kingdom had become in Roman affairs. The young king, barely a teenager, was their figurehead. Behind him stood men determined to drive Caesar out. The conflict began within the walls of Alexandria itself. Skirmishes broke out in the streets. Citizens erected barricades, and soldiers fought among the colonnades and markets. The city, long celebrated as a center of learning and commerce, became a battlefield. Fires spread, consuming warehouses and homes. The air was filled with the smell of smoke and the sound of shouting. For the ordinary people of Alexandria, survival meant staying out of sight, gathering what food they could, and waiting for the violence to pass. One of the tragedies of this conflict, remembered even centuries later, was the damage done to the great library of Alexandria. Accounts differ. Some say the flames from Caesar's ships spread accidentally. Others claim the fighting directly touched the library's storehouses. What was lost is uncertain. Was it a portion of scrolls, or entire collections gathered over generations? No one can say for certain. Yet the image of knowledge consumed by fire has haunted the memory of the Alexandrian War ever since. Meanwhile, Caesar faced a dangerous reality. He had only a small force of Roman soldiers with him, far outnumbered by Ptolemy's supporters. Supplies grew thin, and communication with the outside was cut off. He relied on discipline, strategy, and the loyalty of Cleopatra's faction to hold his position. Each day was a calculation: how to preserve strength until reinforcements could arrive. Cleopatra, for her part, remained by his side. For her, the war was not only about survival but also about proving her legitimacy. By standing with Caesar in the palace, she demonstrated that she was not a fugitive queen or a pawn. She was a ruler willing to share the dangers of battle. Later writers would emphasize her beauty, her charisma, her theatrical entrance into Caesar's presence. Yet what mattered in these months was her resilience. She endured the uncertainty of siege and the hostility of her own people, knowing that only by outlasting her brother's faction could she secure her throne. The turning point came when reinforcements arrived. A Roman general, Mithridates of Pergamum, brought fresh troops, and Caesar moved to meet Ptolemy's forces in open battle near the Nile. The clash was decisive. The boy king's army was defeated, and as he fled, he drowned in the river. The details remain vague. Perhaps his boat overturned. Perhaps he panicked in the water weighed down by armor. However it happened, the Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, became the site of his final defeat. With Ptolemy Xi's death, the resistance collapsed. Caesar restored Cleopatra to the throne, though again, tradition required a co-ruler. This time, it was her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, a child even younger than the brother who had drowned. In practice, the arrangement meant little. Cleopatra was the true sovereign, backed by Caesar's authority. For Rome, the outcome of the Alexandrian War was practical. Caesar had secured Egypt as a stable ally, ensured the flow of grain to Italy, and avoided the embarrassment of defeat. For Cleopatra, the outcome was transformative. She had returned from exile, defeated her rivals, and proven herself capable of navigating both Egyptian politics and Roman power. In the months after the war, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. His name was Ptolemy 15 Philopator Philometor Caesar, but he would be remembered more simply as Caesarion, Little Caesar. To Egyptians, his birth was a moment of triumph. He embodied both the ancient line of the pharaohs and the prestige of Rome's greatest general. In temple inscriptions, Cleopatra presented him as the son of the divine ruler, heir to Egypt's throne. For Caesar, the child's existence was more complicated. In Rome, he already had political enemies. His opponents used every detail of his life to attack him. The idea that he had fathered a son with a foreign queen fed accusations that he sought kingship, that he wished to build a dynasty not in Rome, but abroad. Yet in Alexandria, Caesar allowed Cleopatra to present their son as his heir. He did not deny him. Cleopatra, ever mindful of symbolism, used Caesarion to strengthen her own position. She appeared with him in public processions, in temple rituals, in coins minted with their names. To the priests of Egypt, the boy was a divine child, born of a union between the living goddess and a conqueror favored by fate. To the people, he was a sign that Egypt's line of rulers would continue. Life in Alexandria gradually returned to its rhythms. Merchants reopened their stalls, ships once again carried grain across the Mediterranean, and scholars returned to their studies in whatever portion of the library had survived. Yet beneath the surface, the city was changed. The memory of fire, siege, and betrayal lingered, and the presence of Roman soldiers, even in smaller numbers, reminded everyone that Egypt's independence was now bound to Rome's will. Cleopatra embraced this reality. She knew that survival did not mean rejecting Rome, but negotiating with it. Her reign would be defined not by isolation but by careful alliances, by using charm, intellect, and timing to preserve Egypt's autonomy. The birth of Caesarion gave her a powerful symbol, but it also gave her a burden. She had to ensure that the child would grow into his role, that Egypt would remain strong enough to sustain his inheritance. The Alexandrian War was not the most famous of Caesar's campaigns. In Roman histories, it is often a side note, overshadowed by his battles in Gaul or against Pompey. Yet for Cleopatra, it was the crucible that forged her reign. It tested her resilience, her ability to endure hardship, and her capacity to wield power in partnership with the most dangerous man of her time. And when the war was over, when the fires of Alexandria had cooled and the Nile had carried away the body of her brother, Cleopatra stood not as an exile or a fugitive, but as Queen of Egypt once more, a queen with a child who linked her fate to the destiny of Rome. Still, questions lingered. Could Cleopatra maintain her throne without Caesar's presence in Alexandria? Would Rome continue to protect her? Or would its shifting politics leave her vulnerable once again? And how would the child, Caesarion, fit into a world where dynasties rose and fell not by blood alone, but by the will of Roman generals and senators? When the fires of the Alexandrian War were finally extinguished and Cleopatra's throne secured, Julius Caesar prepared to leave Egypt. Rome called to him. Civil war still raged across the Republic, and his rivals were not yet defeated. For Cleopatra, the departure of her ally was both a risk and an opportunity. Without Caesar's presence, her position in Egypt was less secure. Yet by accompanying him to Rome, she could strengthen her bond to the man whose authority now eclipsed all others. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra sailed to Rome, bringing with her her young son, Caesarion, and a retinue that reflected the wealth and culture of Egypt. The journey itself was a statement. She arrived not as a supplicant queen in exile, but as a sovereign ally. Her presence in the capital of the Republic caused a stir. Rome was a city divided. Caesar's victories in the civil wars had made him dictator, but many resented his concentration of power. The Senate, still clinging to the traditions of the Republic, debated his every move. Into this tense atmosphere came Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, housed in one of Caesar's villas across the Tiber. For the people of Rome, her presence was both fascinating and unsettling. She was foreign, yet familiar from the stories told by merchants and travelers. She embodied wealth and luxury. To some, she was a curiosity, a spectacle from the East. To others, she was a threat, a symbol of monarchy in a city that prided itself on republican values. Cleopatra did not appear in the Senate, nor did she attempt to govern. Her role was subtler. She maintained her dignity as a visiting sovereign, receiving guests, presenting herself as both Pharaoh of Egypt and consort to Caesar. Her son, Caesar Ion, was displayed carefully, a living reminder of her bond with the dictator. In temples back home, inscriptions had already declared him son of the divine ruler. In Rome, his existence stirred whispers. Would Caesar acknowledge him as his heir? Would a foreign-born child stand in line before Roman citizens? These questions unsettled the Senate. Caesar had already adopted his great-nephew, Octavian, as heir. To add Caesar Ion into the succession would complicate the fragile balance of power. Some senators feared the possibility of a dynasty that reached beyond Rome, one tied to an Egyptian queen. Cleopatra's life in Rome was marked by contrasts. On one hand, she lived with luxury, surrounded by servants, Egyptian treasures, and the protection of Caesar's household. On the other, she walked among people who viewed her with suspicion. Satirists mocked her. Pamphlets accused Caesar of weakening Rome by dallying with a queen. Yet through it all, she remained composed, aware that appearances mattered as much as decrees. She also observed Roman life with care. The Republic was unlike Egypt. Power did not flow through temples or dynasties, but through assemblies, magistrates, and armies. Caesar, though dictator, had to manage factions, persuade allies, and silence enemies. Cleopatra learned from this. To rule Egypt while bound to Rome, she would need to master not only her own traditions but also the politics of the Republic. During her stay, Rome itself was undergoing transformation. Caesar undertook reforms, reorganizing the calendar, settling debts, and planning vast public works. Festivals and triumphs filled the city. Cleopatra witnessed Rome not as a distant power but as a living organism, chaotic, ambitious, and restless. She saw its strength but also its divisions. And then, in 44 BCE, the divisions consumed Caesar himself. On the Ides of March, he entered the Senate, unaware of the conspiracy that awaited him. Senators, some of them once his closest allies, drew their daggers and struck. Caesar fell beneath their blows, stabbed 23 times, collapsing at the foot of Pompey's statue. A cruel reminder of the man whose death had drawn him to Egypt years before. The news spread quickly. The dictator was dead. Rome erupted in confusion. Some hailed the assassins as liberators, restoring the Republic from tyranny. Others mourned the fallen general, fearing the chaos that his death would unleash. For Cleopatra, the moment was perilous. Without Caesar, her position in Rome collapsed. She was no longer the consort of the dictator, but a foreign queen in a city suddenly hostile. To remain was dangerous. To leave was necessary. Quietly, she gathered her household, her son, and her treasures, and returned to Alexandria. The voyage home must have been heavy with uncertainty. She had lost her most powerful ally. Caesar Ion, once her strongest symbol, was now vulnerable. A child without recognition in Rome, his father dead, his future in question. Egypt itself remained fragile, still dependent on Roman favor, still burdened with debt. And in Rome, a new struggle was already beginning. The assassins had hoped to restore the Republic, but instead they unleashed another civil war. Caesar's allies, led by Mark Antony and Octavian, rallied to claim his legacy. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra resumed her rule. The temples once again carved her name, the markets filled with grain, and the Nile flowed with its eternal rhythm. Outwardly, stability returned. Inwardly, Cleopatra must have known that Rome's turmoil would reach her again. The Republic was no longer a distant power. It was a storm whose winds swept across the Mediterranean, touching every kingdom in its path. The memory of her years in Rome remained vivid. She had seen the Senate's divisions, the resentment of Caesar's power, the fragility of alliances. She had seen how quickly fortune could turn, even for the most powerful man alive. These lessons would shape her next choices. For Cleopatra, survival now depended on watching Rome carefully, aligning herself with its victors, and protecting her son's inheritance. But as she walked once more through the colonnades of Alexandria, as she presided over festivals and decrees, one question lingered. Without Caesar's hand to shield her, could Egypt remain sovereign, or would her throne be swept away by the tides of Rome's unending wars? When Cleopatra returned to Alexandria after Caesar's assassination, she carried with her the weight of uncertainty. Rome, which had seemed to her both a source of power and of protection, was once again descending into civil war. The men who struck Caesar down believed they had freed the Republic. Instead, they unleashed chaos. Into that chaos stepped two figures who would shape the next chapter of Cleopatra's life: Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, and Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. At first, Egypt remained quiet, watching from a distance. Cleopatra continued the rituals of rulership, issuing decrees, attending temple festivals, ensuring the annual grain harvest. In official inscriptions, she stood tall as Pharaoh, a daughter of the gods, mother of Caesarion. Yet she knew that Egypt's survival depended not only on its own strength, but on aligning itself with the victors of Rome's wars. Mark Antony was, by temperament, very different from Julius Caesar. Where Caesar had been disciplined, strategic, and careful with appearances, Antony was bold, flamboyant, and charismatic. He had fought at Caesar's side through years of campaigns and had earned the loyalty of many soldiers. After Caesar's death, he seized the reins of power in Rome, presenting himself as the natural successor to his fallen leader. But Antony was not alone. The young Octavian, scarcely 20 years old, claimed his inheritance as Caesar's adopted son. At first underestimated, Octavian proved shrewd beyond his years, gathering support, winning allies, and using Caesar's name as a rallying cry. Between Antony and Octavian stood the Senate, confused and divided, and the assassins, who hoped still to preserve their vision of the Republic. It was into this shifting landscape that Cleopatra's name resurfaced in Roman politics. Some accused her of having lured Caesar away from the Republic. Others whispered that she sought to use her son, Caesarion, to claim Caesar's legacy. Rumors traveled faster than ships. To protect herself and her throne, Cleopatra needed clarity. Which of Rome's leaders would prevail? Which would look favorably upon Egypt? In 42 BCE, the question seemed answered. At the Battle of Philippi, Antony and Octavian defeated the assassins Brutus and Cassius. The Republic's defenders were gone, their armies shattered. Antony and Octavian, along with a third man, Lepidus, formed what became known as the Second Triumvirate. Together, they divided Rome's territories among themselves. Octavian controlled the west. Antony took the east. Lepidus, less significant, received Africa. For Cleopatra, this division mattered. Egypt lay in the east. That meant Antony, not Octavian, would be the Roman power nearest her kingdom. If she was to maintain her throne, she would have to deal with him. And so, in 41 BCE, Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus, in Asia Minor. The summons was more than a request. It was a test of loyalty. Antony wanted to know whether Egypt would support him, provide resources, and acknowledge his authority. Cleopatra, understanding the stakes, prepared for the meeting with the same care she had once shown in her dramatic entrance to Caesar. The accounts of her arrival are filled with imagery, recorded by later historians who delighted in describing the spectacle. Cleopatra sailed up the river on a magnificent barge, its sails purple, its oars silver. She lay beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as the goddess Isis, attended by servants dressed as cupids and nymphs. Musicians played, incense burned, and the air was filled with the scent of perfumes. Crowds lined the banks to watch, dazzled by the display. Antony, known for his love of excess in theater, was enthralled. Cleopatra had calculated her entrance perfectly. She did not come as a supplicant queen, but as an equal, a sovereign who could match Rome's grandeur with her own. Their first meeting was less a negotiation than a performance. a reminder that politics could be shaped as much by image as by force. The bond between them was immediate. Antony, like Caesar before him, recognized Cleopatra's intelligence, her wit, and her ability to speak as both ruler and partner. Cleopatra, for her part, saw in Antony a new protector, one whose ambitions required allies and resources. Egypt could provide both. Their alliance deepened quickly, blending politics with intimacy. Antony returned with Cleopatra to Alexandria, where he lived with her for a time, leaving behind the formal duties of Rome. To his critics, he had abandoned discipline for indulgence, surrendering to the luxuries of the East. To Cleopatra, his presence was a victory. Once again, she had secured Roman support for her throne, and once again, she had bound Egypt's fate to the man who held power in Rome. Together, they spent months in what later writers called the inimitable livers, a circle of revelry and feasting in Alexandria. Yet beneath the banquets and entertainments lay serious strategy. Cleopatra gained territory for Egypt, recovering lands once lost. Antony gained wealth, ships, and grain to fund his campaigns. Each used the other, but each also found in the other a kind of companionship that defied the harsh politics of their world. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra bore Antony twins, a boy, Alexander Helios, and a girl, Cleopatra Selene. To Egyptians, the birth of royal children was another sign of divine blessing. To Romans, it was troubling. Once again, a powerful Roman had tied himself to a foreign queen, raising questions about loyalty, heritage, and the future of the Republic. Antony eventually returned to Rome, drawn back into its endless struggles. There, he married Octavian's sister, Octavia, as part of a political alliance meant to ease tensions between the two men. Cleopatra remained in Alexandria, ruling Egypt, raising her children, and waiting. She knew Antony's marriage was political, not personal. She also knew that when the time came, he would look eastward again, toward her. And so he did. By 37 BCE, Antony returned to Cleopatra, resuming their partnership. Rome was still divided, still fragile, and Antony required her wealth to pursue his grand ambitions. Campaigns in Parthia, expansion of Roman power into the east. Cleopatra provided funds, supplies, and support, strengthening their bond even further. Their alliance was more than romance, more than spectacle. It was survival for both. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to sustain his ambitions. Cleopatra needed Antony's protection to secure her throne and her children's future. Together, they represented a union that was both powerful and dangerous, one that threatened to eclipse Octavian's influence in the West. But Cleopatra also knew the risks. She had seen Caesar rise and fall. She had witnessed how quickly Rome turned on those it feared. Antony, for all his charisma, carried within him both greatness and weakness. His recklessness, his indulgence, his hunger for glory. These would one day bring him into direct conflict with Octavian. And when that day came, Cleopatra would once again find her kingdom caught between survival and destruction. For now, however, she enjoyed a moment of strength. Alexandria thrived with festivals and prosperity. The Nile carried grain, the temples echoed with rituals, and the queen stood at the height of her power, mother of royal children, partner of a Roman triumvir, sovereign of Egypt. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, the same question that had haunted her since Caesar's death remained. Could any alliance with Rome truly preserve Egypt's independence? Or was each bond only another step toward her kingdom's inevitable surrender? By the late 30s BCE, the alliance between Mark Antony and Cleopatra had become more than a personal bond. It was now a political reality that reverberated through the halls of Rome. Antony, one of the most powerful men of the Roman world, had tied himself to the Queen of Egypt, and together they were shaping a vision of power that challenged the fragile balance of the triumvirate. In Rome, Octavian watched with growing unease. Young, determined, and coldly calculating, he had spent years consolidating his hold over the West. His reputation was that of a dutiful son, championing Caesar's legacy, defending traditional Roman values. Yet in the East, Antony and Cleopatra were building something altogether different. a court that blended Roman ambition with Egyptian grandeur, and a partnership that seemed to threaten Octavian's claim to supremacy. The rift between Antony and Octavian widened slowly at first. Each man accused the other of failing to fulfill promises, of withholding troops, of maneuvering for greater power. Octavia, Antony's Roman wife and Octavian's sister, found herself caught between them, a living symbol of the alliance they had sworn to uphold. But the marriage, meant as a bridge, became instead a reminder of Antony's duplicity, for his heart and his loyalties remained with Cleopatra. In 36 BCE, Antony launched a great campaign against Parthia, Rome's eastern rival. It was a disaster. Poor planning, harsh weather, and fierce resistance forced his armies into retreat. Antony lost men, supplies, and prestige. His enemies in Rome seized the moment, portraying him as reckless and unfit to lead. Cleopatra, however, stood by him. She provided refuge, supplies, and funds to rebuild his strength. Where Rome mocked him, Egypt embraced him. And so Antony turned further away from Rome and further toward Cleopatra. By 34 BCE, their partnership reached a dramatic peak. In a series of ceremonies later called the Donations of Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra staged a display of power unlike anything Rome had seen. Before a gathered crowd in Alexandria, Antony distributed lands and titles to Cleopatra and their children. Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, was proclaimed King of Kings. Alexander Helios, their son, was given dominion over eastern territories. Cleopatra Selene, their daughter, was named ruler of lands in North Africa. Cleopatra herself was hailed as Queen of Kings, the living embodiment of Isis, ruler not only of Egypt but of vast territories stretching beyond the Nile. For Egyptians, the spectacle was a moment of pride, a vision of restored grandeur. For Romans, it was alarming, even scandalous. Antony, once the loyal general of Caesar, appeared to be handing Rome's conquests to a foreign queen and her children. In the eyes of Octavian, this was not only dangerous, it was treason. Propaganda became the next battlefield. Octavian, a master of image and rhetoric, began to craft a story. Antony, he declared, was no longer truly Roman. He had been bewitched by Cleopatra, seduced by her luxuries, corrupted by her Eastern decadence. He wore foreign dress, spoke foreign tongues, and abandoned his Roman wife. Rome, Octavian warned, was in danger of falling under the sway of an exotic queen who sought to rule not only Egypt but the Republic itself. The Roman people, weary of civil wars, responded to this message. They feared monarchy, they feared foreign domination, and Cleopatra, despite her intelligence and charisma, became for them the perfect villain. Octavian spoke not of Antony as his rival, but of Cleopatra as Rome's true enemy, casting himself as the defender of tradition, family, and freedom. Antony, meanwhile, returned to Alexandria, where he lived openly with Cleopatra. Together, they ruled not as supplicants to Rome, but as sovereigns of a new order. Antony still held Roman authority, but his base, his strength, and his vision lay increasingly in the east. The couple hosted lavish festivals, paraded in golden processions, and blended the imagery of pharaohs and Roman triumphs into something unprecedented. But beneath the splendor, cracks began to show. Antony's reliance on Cleopatra's wealth made him appear weak to his Roman supporters. Cleopatra's assertiveness, though natural in Egypt, unsettled Roman sensibilities, which expected women to remain in the shadows. Their children, presented as heirs to empires, symbolized not unity but division. By 32 BCE, the fragile partnership between Octavian and Antony shattered completely. Antony divorced Octavia, severing the last tie between the two men. Octavian seized the opportunity, declaring that Antony's actions proved his loyalty was no longer to Rome but to Cleopatra. In a dramatic move, Octavian read Antony's will before the Senate, or at least claimed to. In it, Antony allegedly asked to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, not in Rome. Whether the document was authentic or forged hardly mattered. To the Senate, it was proof that Antony had abandoned his homeland. The stage was now set for war, Octavian declared that his fight was not against Antony, but against Cleopatra. It was she, he insisted, who threatened Rome, she who had ensnared Antony, she who sought to place her children on the throne of the Republic. By shifting the focus to Cleopatra, Octavian unified Rome under his cause. Senators who might have hesitated to fight Antony found it easier to march against a foreign queen. Cleopatra, for her part, prepared Egypt for the coming storm. She commanded fleets, raised funds, and stood beside Antony as his partner, not merely as an ally. In her mind, this was a fight not only for her throne but for the future of her dynasty, her children, and perhaps even Egypt's independence. She knew the risks. She had seen how quickly Rome consumed its rivals. But she also believed in Antony and in their shared vision of power. And so, as the year 31 BCE dawned, the world held its breath. Octavian, master of the West, disciplined and calculating, prepared his legions for the decisive confrontation. Antony and Cleopatra, rulers of the East, radiant and defiant, gathered their fleets upon the waters. The two great forces of the Mediterranean were now on a collision course, one that would decide not only the fate of Cleopatra and Antony, but the destiny of Rome itself. The year was 31 BCE. Across the Mediterranean world, rumors spread like the winds that carried the sails of merchant ships. Two great powers were preparing for war, and every kingdom, every city, every soldier knew that the outcome would shape the future for generations. On one side stood Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, still young but already hardened by years of political struggle. He commanded the West, Italy, Spain, Gaul, and much of North Africa. His legions were disciplined, his fleets well supplied. Beside him stood Marcus Agrippa, a general of exceptional skill, whose victories at sea had already secured Octavian's reputation as a man of destiny. On the other side stood Antony and Cleopatra. Together they commanded the East, Egypt, Greece, Syria, and lands stretching deep into Asia. Their fleets were vast, their wealth immense, and their resolve unshaken. For Cleopatra, this was more than a Roman quarrel. It was the culmination of her life's gamble, to preserve Egypt's independence through alliance, to ensure her children's inheritance, and to stand as the equal of Rome's greatest. The stage was set not in Rome, nor in Alexandria, but in the waters off western Greece, near a small promontory called Actium. It was here that the fleets of both sides gathered, and it was here that history would pivot. The preparations for the battle were immense. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a fleet of over 200 warships, many of them great quinquiremes and larger vessels, reinforced with towers and heavy rams. Cleopatra's Egyptian fleet was famed for its size and craftsmanship, ships built not only for war but for presence, their sails and prows glinting beneath the sun. Yet this grandeur carried weight. The ships were large, slower to maneuver, and demanded supplies in vast quantities. Octavian, by contrast, favored lighter vessels, triremes and quadriremes, more agile in the water, better suited for quick strikes and sudden maneuvers. Under Agrippa's command, they formed a disciplined force, honed by training and coordinated by signals that could turn the tide in moments. For months, the two sides watched each other, maneuvering in the Ionian Sea. Antony established his camp at Actium, fortified on land, his fleet anchored nearby. Octavian's forces held positions across the bay, cutting supply lines, waiting for time and hunger to weaken their foes. The siege was as much about patience as it was about strength. Inside Antony's camp, morale began to waver. Disease spread, supplies dwindled, soldiers questioned their leaders. Why linger here, they asked, when they might retreat to Egypt, where strength and security awaited. But Antony hesitated. To retreat was to admit weakness. To fight was to risk all. Cleopatra, ever calculating, urged him to act decisively, to break through Octavian's blockade and secure a return to Egypt. It was not pride that guided her, but strategy. She knew the longer they lingered, the more their forces would decay. And so, on the morning of September 2nd, 31 BCE, the battle began. The waters off Actium filled with movement as the great ships of Antony and Cleopatra emerged from their anchorage. They stretched across the bay, oars beating in unison, sails lowered, prows glinting with bronze. Across from them, Octavian's smaller fleet awaited, disciplined, compact, ready to strike. The opening was cautious. Both sides measured distance, maneuvered for advantage. Antony's heavier ships attempted to press forward, but Agrippa's lighter vessels darted around them, striking at oars, harassing their flanks, forcing them into tighter formations. The clash of wood and iron echoed across the waters, the shouts of men mixing with the crash of rams against hulls. For hours, the battle wavered without decision. Antony's larger ships resisted well, but they could not press their advantage. Octavian's fleet harried them, refusing to be drawn into direct collision. The sea became a grid of smoke and fire, sails burning, splintered with drifting, men clinging to wreckage. And then came the moment that has puzzled historians ever since. From her position with the fleet, Cleopatra suddenly raised her sails. Her 60 ships, still intact and richly provisioned, broke away from the battle line. With the wind at their backs, they streamed southward, away from the carnage, heading for the open sea and the safety of Egypt. Why she chose that moment remains a question. Some believe it was a planned maneuver, a signal agreed upon with Antony, an escape should the battle turn grim. Others suggest it was fear, the instinct of survival overtaking calculation. Whatever the reason, the sight of Cleopatra's ships leaving the battle sent a shock through Antony's fleet. For Antony himself, the decision was immediate. Abandoning the fight, he gathered a small squadron and pursued her, breaking through Octavian's line to follow the Egyptian queen. The rest of his fleet, left leaderless, faltered. Some continued to fight valiantly, others surrendered, and many burned or sank in the waters. By the day's end, the sea was littered with wreckage. Octavian and Agrippa had triumphed. Antony's fleet was destroyed or captured. His soldiers, stranded on land, surrendered in droves. The battle was over, and with it, Antony and Cleopatra's hopes of challenging Rome. For Cleopatra and Antony, the retreat to Egypt was both escape and defeat. They had preserved their lives and a fraction of their fleet, but their power was broken. No longer could they command the loyalty of Rome's eastern provinces. No longer could they present themselves as the equals of Octavian. Yet even in defeat, the story did not end. In Alexandria, they still held their throne. They still commanded wealth. They still had their children, their armies, and their city. And Cleopatra, as she had done many times before, began to plan again. But the world had shifted. Octavian now held the advantage. His victory at Actium was not only military but symbolic. Rome saw him as the savior of the Republic, the man who had freed them from Cleopatra's supposed ambitions. In truth, the Republic itself was fading, but for the moment, Octavian stood as its champion. And in Alexandria, Cleopatra must have asked herself, could she still negotiate with the man who now held her fate in his hands? Or had the tide of history already carried her too far from safety to return? When Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria after the defeat at Actium, the mood in the city was heavy with unease. The queen who had once dazzled Rome, who had presided over ceremonies of power and grandeur, now returned not as a victor but as a survivor. The fleet that had once stretched proudly across the Mediterranean was gone. The dream of ruling east and west together had shattered in the waters off Greece. And yet, life in Alexandria did not simply stop. The city, as it had done for centuries, continued its rhythms. Ships still carried grain down the Nile. Merchants still haggled in the great market squares. Scholars still gathered in the library, debating philosophy and astronomy. To the ordinary Alexandrian, the queen remained on the throne, the palaces still glittered in the sun, and the Nile still rose with its annual flood. But beneath this surface of stability, Cleopatra and Antony faced a grim reality. Their position had narrowed. They no longer commanded the loyalty of Rome's provinces. Their armies had dwindled, their allies had vanished, and their reputation had suffered a wound that could not be healed. What remained was Egypt itself, still wealthy, still fertile, but increasingly isolated. Cleopatra did not surrender to despair. She had faced reversals before. As a young queen, she had been exiled and returned. She had seen her father cling to power only through Roman favor. She had learned that survival was not only about force, but about patience, negotiation, and adaptation. Now, she turned to strategy once again. If Octavian could not be defeated in battle, perhaps he could be placated in peace. She sent envoys, offering tribute, offering loyalty, even offering her crown if it meant preserving Egypt and the future of her children. But Octavian was no longer in a mood to compromise. He understood that his power depended not only on victory but on image. Cleopatra had become, in his propaganda, the symbol of corruption and monarchy, the foreign queen who threatened Rome. To spare her was to weaken the story he had crafted, the story of himself as Rome's savior. Antony, meanwhile, struggled with his own decline. Once the commander of Caesar's armies, once the master of Rome's legions, he was now reduced to a king in exile, dependent on Cleopatra's wealth and her city. He still held soldiers, still trained them in the courtyards of Alexandria, but he knew his time was running out. His authority had been broken at Actium, and every man in his service knew it. Still, Alexandria prepared for war. Fortifications were strengthened. Weapons were forged. Ships were repaired where possible. Cleopatra and Antony both appeared in public, dressed in their finery, projecting confidence even as doubt gnawed at the edges. They knew that appearances mattered. A queen who faltered would lose her people. A general who despaired would lose his men. In the year 30 BCE, Octavian marched. His legions advanced methodically, securing territory, crossing the deserts, moving closer with each passing month. His progress was steady, inevitable, and unrelenting. Antony's scattered forces attempted resistance, but they were no match for the discipline and numbers of Octavian's army. At last, Octavian reached the outskirts of Alexandria. The great city, with its walls and towers, its harbors and palaces, faced its final trial. From the sea, Roman ships appeared, sails white against the horizon. From the land, Roman legions advanced, their standards glinting in the sun. Inside the city, Cleopatra made her preparations. She gathered her treasures, gold, jewels, scrolls of wisdom collected over centuries, and placed them in tombs she had begun to build for herself and Antony. These were not the actions of surrender, but of a queen preparing for the end, ensuring that her memory would not vanish, that her legacy would be preserved even if her reign was not. The battle for Alexandria was swift. Antony's forces, though brave, were outnumbered and exhausted. In skirmishes outside the city, they faltered. His cavalry deserted him. His infantry surrendered in groups. The once mighty general, who had stood beside Caesar and marched across continents, now watched his army collapse in the streets of Alexandria. It was then that a rumor reached Antony. Word spread that Cleopatra had taken her own life, sealing herself in her tomb, unwilling to be paraded as Octavian's prize. Stricken with grief, Antony resolved to follow her. Drawing his sword, he fell upon it, delivering the wound himself. Yet fate was cruel. The wound was not immediately fatal. Bleeding, weak, and near death, he was carried by loyal servants to Cleopatra's side. When the two were reunited, the scene was somber. Cleopatra, very much alive, embraced him. She had not died, though she had prepared herself for death. Now she held Antony as he slipped away, his life ebbing in the queen's arms. With his final breaths, he urged her to make peace, to protect their children, to do what she could to preserve Egypt. And then Antony, the soldier of Rome, the lover of Cleopatra, was gone. Cleopatra was left alone. Her partner in rule, her ally in ambition, had fallen. Octavian was at the gates. Her city was surrounded. Yet still she considered her choices. Could she meet Octavian as a queen, negotiate terms, preserve something of her dynasty? Or would he insist on humiliation, dragging her in chains through Rome, displaying her as a conquered monarch before his triumph? She met Octavian once. Accounts differ on their exchange, but most agree she tried to charm him, as she had once charmed Caesar and Antony. Yet Octavian was not Caesar and he was not Antony. He was young, cold, deliberate, and unmoved by her presence. He had no need for her companionship, no desire for her alliance. He wanted only her submission and her wealth. Cleopatra understood then that her end was near. To live was to face humiliation. To die was to preserve dignity. Quietly, she arranged her affairs. She saw her children, entrusted their care to allies where she could, and withdrew into the mausoleum she had built for herself. There, surrounded by the symbols of her reign, she prepared to end her story on her own terms. The manner of her death remains one of history's mysteries. Some say she took poison concealed in a hollow comb. Others claim she applied venom to a wound. The most famous account tells of an ASP, a snake smuggled into her chamber, whose bite delivered her swiftly to death. However it occurred, what matters is not the method but the meaning. Cleopatra, last pharaoh of Egypt, chose her end, refusing to be displayed as a captive, refusing to surrender the final measure of her sovereignty. When Octavian entered her chamber, he found her lifeless, adorned as a queen, her attendants also dead beside her. The woman who had shared the counsels of Caesar, who had fought beside Antony, who had ruled Egypt with intelligence and will, was gone. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt passed fully into Roman hands. The great kingdom of the Nile, which had stood for millennia, became a province of an empire. Octavian seized its wealth, secured its grain supply, and declared victory. In Rome, he would celebrate a triumph not over Antony, a Roman citizen, but over Cleopatra, the foreign queen. And from that triumph he would fashion his greatest title, Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. For Egypt, it was the end of an era. The line of the Ptolemies, descended from Alexander's generals, ended with Cleopatra. For the people of Alexandria, life continued, as it always did, with markets, festivals, and the flow of the Nile. But the sense of independence was gone. From now on, Egypt was not a kingdom but a province, its rulers sent from Rome, its destiny tied to an empire far away. And for history, Cleopatra's death marked both an ending and a beginning. The age of pharaohs had passed. The age of emperors had begun. But one question lingers across the centuries. Did Cleopatra's choice preserve her dignity, or did it hasten the fall of Egypt into Roman hands? With Cleopatra's death, Egypt entered a new chapter, one in which it would no longer guide its own fate. Octavian claimed the land as his personal possession, not even as a regular Roman province. The Nile's grain would feed Rome's people. Its riches would fill Rome's treasuries, and its ancient temples would now honor emperors instead of pharaohs. Yet Cleopatra herself did not vanish with her kingdom. In many ways, her death only deepened her presence. For the Romans who survived her, for poets, historians, and statesmen, she became not merely a queen, but a symbol, a figure onto whom they could project their fears, their ambitions, and their lessons. In Rome, Octavian staged his triumph. He displayed the treasures of Egypt, golden statues, exotic animals, and the wealth of the Nile carried through the streets. But what Rome did not see was Cleopatra herself. She was gone, denied to Octavian's victory parade by her own choice. Instead, he paraded her children, including the twins she had borne to Antony. They were led in chains, reminders of a dynasty broken, trophies of conquest. Caesarion, the son she claimed by Julius Caesar, was quietly executed on Octavian's orders. The others, still young, were spared, raised in Roman households, their future lives scattered by adoption and marriage. Cleopatra's image in Rome was carefully shaped. Poets described her as dangerous, decadent, a temptress who had lured Antony away from duty. Horace and Propertius wrote of her as a witch queen, defeated by Rome's virtue. Virgil, in his great epic, hinted at her presence as a looming threat vanquished by Augustus, the savior of order. These accounts were not history in the strictest sense, but propaganda, a way of reinforcing Octavian's authority, of showing that Rome had been saved from a foreign monarch who sought to dominate it. And yet, even in this hostile portrayal, Cleopatra remained unforgettable. She was no ordinary queen, no distant ruler easily dismissed. Her intelligence, her will, her dramatic life and death had imprinted themselves too deeply upon memory. In Egypt, the story was different. Cleopatra was remembered not as a villain, but as the last in a line of rulers who had fought to preserve independence. In temples, her image endured in carvings, standing beside the gods, adorned in the regalia of pharaohs. To her people, she had been a sovereign who spoke their language, honored their traditions, and lived as a pharaoh, not just as a Greek queen of the Ptolemaic line. For centuries after, Egyptians spoke her name as they remembered the moment when their ancient kingdom passed into Rome's grasp. Over time, her memory shifted and transformed. In the centuries of the Roman Empire, she became a figure of fascination. Writers debated her choices. Some saw her as a tragic heroine undone by love. Others painted her as a schemer, consumed by ambition. Her story spread far beyond Alexandria, far beyond Rome, carried in scrolls, in tales, and in the whispers of history. In the Middle Ages, when Europe's connection to the classical world weakened, Cleopatra's name survived more as legend than fact. She was woven into romances, imagined as a sorceress or an enchantress, her life less historical than mythical. Scholars preserved fragments of the older accounts, but much of her reality blurred into fable. It was during the Renaissance that Cleopatra's story rose again in vivid form. Artists, poets, and dramatists rediscovered the ancient sources and transformed her into a symbol of human passion and power. Painters depicted her death with snakes at her breast, dramatists wrote of her as the lover of Antony, and philosophers debated her role as both ruler and seductress. Shakespeare, in his play Antony and Cleopatra, gave her perhaps the most enduring stage presence, portraying her as witty, commanding, vulnerable, and magnificent, all at once. Through all these retellings, one truth remained constant. Cleopatra was never forgotten. Few rulers of the ancient world are remembered with such intensity. Kings and emperors ruled longer, built greater monuments, commanded larger armies, yet their names faded into obscurity. Cleopatra, though she ruled a single kingdom at the end of its independence, became a figure who haunted memory. Why? Perhaps because her story is one of extremes. She lived at the intersection of two worlds, the ancient traditions of Egypt and the rising power of Rome. She joined her fate to the two greatest men of her age, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and through them shaped the destiny of nations. She ruled as a woman in a world of men, commanding not only armies but narratives. And when defeat came, she met it not as a captive, but on her own terms. For historians, her legacy is also one of questions. Was she truly the manipulative seductress that Roman writers described? Or was she a capable ruler whose political skill was overshadowed by misogyny and propaganda? Did she seek to dominate Rome, or merely to preserve Egypt in the face of overwhelming force? Was her death an act of despair, or a final demonstration of sovereignty? Each generation has answered these questions differently, shaped by its own values and concerns. Even archaeology has added to her mystique. Temples still bear her likeness. Coins carry her profile, showing her not as the glamorous figure of later art, but as she truly appeared: strong features, sharp nose, determined eyes. These coins remind us that Cleopatra was not merely a character in poetry, but a living monarch, presenting herself deliberately to her people, crafting her image as carefully as any ruler today. Her city, Alexandria, carried her memory too. Though much of the ancient city has vanished beneath waves and modern streets, the echoes of her reign linger. The palaces where she walked, the harbors where her ships once gathered, the tomb where she may have been laid to rest. All of these have drawn centuries of curiosity. Archaeologists still search for her final resting place, hoping to uncover a tangible link to the queen whose story continues to fascinate. And beyond the ruins, beyond the accounts, her presence has endured in culture. She has appeared in novels, operas, films, and histories, each reshaping her to fit its age. To some, she is a romantic heroine, to others, a cunning strategist, to still others, the embodiment of female power. Few figures of history have been so continuously reimagined, so persistently remembered. What is certain is that Cleopatra's death did not silence her. In many ways, it amplified her. By refusing to live as a captive, she ensured that her story would remain her own. Octavian might have claimed Egypt, but Cleopatra claimed memory. And so, more than 2,000 years after her reign, we still speak her name. We still ask the same questions the Romans once asked. Who was Cleopatra, truly? A queen undone by love? A ruler who gambled too boldly? Or the last great pharaoh, who, in the face of inevitable conquest, preserved her dignity in the only way left to her? The answers shift, but the fascination endures. And perhaps that is her greatest legacy. Not the lands she ruled, nor the battles she fought, but the fact that centuries later, as you listen now, you are still drawn into her story, still carried into the world she shaped, still reflecting on the choices she made as she faced the tide of history. When Cleopatra passed from the world, Egypt itself did not vanish, though it ceased to be independent. The land of the Nile, ancient and fertile, became something new, a province of Rome, though unlike any other. Octavian, now soon to be Augustus, did not treat Egypt as he treated Spain, Gaul, or Syria. Instead, he claimed it as his personal domain, his private possession, a jewel in his imperial crown. For the Egyptians, this was a profound change. They had lived for centuries under rulers who were, in name at least, pharaohs. Even the Macedonian dynasty of the Ptolemies had taken on the titles and rituals of Egyptian kingship. Cleopatra had appeared in temples beside Isis, Ra, and Horus, her figure carved with crowns and scepters. Now, the divine pharaoh was gone. In his place, a foreign emperor ruled from far away, across the sea, his face unfamiliar, his language not their own. Yet daily life in Egypt continued, as it always had, shaped less by distant politics than by the rhythm of the Nile. Each year the river rose and fell, flooding fields, renewing soil, feeding the people. Farmers still tilled the same earth, sowed grain, and cut papyrus. Villagers still prayed in local shrines, still buried their dead with the rites of their ancestors. The temples, though increasingly Romanized, remained centers of community life. For the priests of Egypt, the transition was both loss and opportunity. They no longer served a pharaoh present among them, but Rome allowed them to continue their rituals. In some temples, Augustus himself was honored as pharaoh, his name inscribed in hieroglyphs, though he never wore the crowns in person. This strange compromise meant that to the Egyptian eye, kingship continued, even if the king was far away. Economically, Rome transformed Egypt into a resource. Grain was the lifeblood of the empire, and the Nile Valley was one of the richest grain-producing regions in the world. Ships carried vast quantities of wheat from Alexandria to Rome, feeding the capital's swelling population. This flow of food was so crucial that Roman emperors tightly controlled access to Egypt. Senators were forbidden to enter the province without permission, lest they meddle in a land so vital to Rome's survival. The city of Alexandria remained a marvel. Its lighthouse still guided ships into the great harbor. Its library, though diminished, still held knowledge from across the world. Greek remained the dominant language in administration and culture, though Latin gained importance as Roman officials arrived. Markets bustled with trade. Spices from Arabia, silks from the east, glass from Syria, papyrus from the Nile. Life in Alexandria was cosmopolitan, a blend of Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and Jewish communities. For ordinary Egyptians, however, Rome's presence was most visible in taxation. The new rulers demanded tribute in coin and in kind. Farmers owed a share of their harvest, craftsmen paid levies, and merchants were monitored closely. The Roman governor, known as the prefect of Egypt, oversaw everything with absolute authority, answerable only to the emperor himself. To the villagers along the Nile, this meant more regulation, more officials, and less freedom. And yet, in many respects, life endured as before. Egyptians had long lived under foreign rulers: Persians, Macedonians, and Greeks. Rome was another layer in that long history, another power claiming dominion over their land. The farmers still looked to the Nile, not to Rome, for their survival. The priests still preserved their rituals, even as their temples slowly aged. The artisans still carved, painted, and built in the styles of their ancestors, mixing old traditions with new influences. In the countryside, Roman soldiers appeared as garrisons, posted in forts along the river. They were strangers at first, speaking Latin or Greek, marching under standards unfamiliar to Egyptian eyes. But over time, they settled, married local women, and raised children. The army became part of the landscape, another presence woven into Egypt's long tapestry. The memory of Cleopatra lingered, but it faded gradually. For those who had seen her reign, she remained a figure of loss and transition, the last pharaoh who had spoken their language and stood among them. For younger generations, she was a tale, a story of the queen who defied Rome and died by her own hand. In Alexandria, her image appeared in statues and coins, reminders of a different age. But as years passed, Rome's dominance became the new normal. Augustus himself visited Egypt only briefly. He stood in Alexandria, gazed upon the land he now claimed, and ensured his authority was firmly established. Yet he preferred to rule from afar, through his prefects. Egypt became less a kingdom, more a granary, a source of wealth, a foundation for the empire's stability. Life after Cleopatra was not a story of grand battles or dramatic events. It was a quieter history, one of adaptation, survival, and continuity. Families tended their fields, traders carried goods along the Nile, scribes recorded taxes on papyrus scrolls. The rhythms of Egyptian life endured, as they had endured foreign rule many times before. The temples continued to echo with prayers, though the language of power had shifted from hieroglyphs to Greek and Latin. Yet something had changed forever. No longer would Egypt stand as an independent actor on the world stage. Its destiny was now tied to Rome's. Its pharaohs were gone, replaced by emperors who never walked its streets. Its wealth flowed outward, feeding distant peoples. And its queen, the last to bear the crowns of Egypt, remained a ghost in memory, her presence felt but her voice silenced. Still, the people lived on. The Nile rose and fell as it always had. Children were born, grew, and learned the stories of their ancestors. Temples opened their doors each morning. Markets filled with goods and chatter. And so, even in conquest, Egypt endured, transformed, yet resilient. And so you might ask yourself, in this long chain of history, was Egypt truly conquered? Or did it simply continue, absorbing each ruler, each invader, into its endless flow, as the Nile absorbs every tributary? When Egypt became a province of Rome, many believed its ancient traditions might wither and fade. The Nile Valley had already endured centuries of foreign rule, first Persian, then Macedonian, then Ptolemaic. Now Rome, vast and powerful, seemed poised to erase what remained of the pharaoh's world. And yet, what followed was not an ending, but a quiet persistence. Egyptian culture did not vanish. It survived, reshaped and adapted, like the river itself winding around obstacles, flowing steadily toward the sea. For centuries, Egypt had been home to one of the world's oldest civilizations. Its temples, carved with hieroglyphs, told stories of gods and kings stretching back thousands of years. Its people worshipped deities older than the Roman state, older even than the city of Athens. When Augustus claimed Egypt, he inherited not only its land and wealth but its traditions, and those traditions proved enduring. At first, Rome allowed the temples to continue their rituals. Priests still dressed in linen, purified themselves with sacred water, and offered incense to the gods. In Karnak and Philae, the chants of hymns still echoed. The gods were called upon for fertility, protection, and balance, just as they had been for generations. To the Egyptians, this continuity mattered deeply. A foreign emperor might rule in name, but Ma'at, the cosmic order, was preserved through the rituals of the priests. The emperors of Rome, though far away, were absorbed into this system. Augustus and his successors were depicted on temple walls in the guise of pharaohs, offering gifts to the gods. Their names were carved in hieroglyphs beside Ra and Osiris. They likely never understood the full meaning of these depictions, but for Egyptian subjects, it was a sign that kingship, though altered, still endured. In stone, the pharaoh had not vanished. He had merely changed shape. Language, too, played its part in survival. Greek remained the tongue of government and elite society, but the Egyptian language persisted in homes and villages. Hieroglyphs continued in temples, though they grew rarer with time. In daily writing, Egyptians used Demotic script, a simplified form suited for contracts, letters, and records. Even under Roman administration, scribes wrote in this flowing hand, preserving a link to their ancestors. Later, a new script would emerge, known as Coptic, blending the Egyptian tongue with Greek letters. Through Coptic, the ancient language endured well into the Christian era. In art and architecture, old forms continued alongside new. Temples were still built in traditional style, their columns massive, their walls covered in carvings. At Dendera and Edfu, great complexes rose under the Ptolemies and were finished under the Romans. These temples were not ruins of a forgotten past. They were living centers of worship, funded by local communities, maintained by generations of priests. Even as Rome spread its statues and forums across the Mediterranean, in Egypt the style of the pharaohs remained alive. The countryside preserved ancient rhythms most of all. Farmers marked the year by the rise of the Nile, just as their ancestors had done under Ramses and Akhenaten. They offered thanks to Hapi, the god of the flood, for rich silt and plentiful harvests. Villagers built mud brick houses in the same fashion as centuries before, grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, and weaving linen. In these routines, history's great shifts mattered less than the turning of the seasons and the flooding of the river. Even beliefs about the afterlife persisted. Egyptians continued to bury their dead with care, providing amulets, shrouds, and sometimes painted portraits. In Roman times, a new tradition emerged, the Fayum mummy portraits. These remarkable works combined Egyptian burial practices with Roman artistic styles. The mummies were still wrapped in linen, but their faces were painted on wooden panels in vivid, lifelike detail. The result was a blending of traditions, the ancient desire for eternal life joined with Roman portraiture, creating images that gaze back at us even today. Religion itself evolved slowly. The gods of Egypt remained central, but Roman deities entered as well. Some were merged with native ones, Zeus with Ammonius, Isis with Venus, Horus with Apollo. The cult of Isis, in particular, spread far beyond Egypt, reaching Rome, Greece, and even Gaul. Temples to Isis were built across the empire, her worshippers seeking her protection on land and sea. What had once been the faith of Egypt became a global phenomenon, woven into Roman spirituality. And yet, change was inevitable. As centuries passed, the dominance of temples weakened. Taxes drained their wealth, Roman officials limited their authority, and Christianity eventually spread across the empire. But in the first centuries of Roman rule, the survival of Egyptian culture was clear. In rituals, in language, in art, in the daily lives of farmers, the old ways continued. To walk through a village in Roman Egypt would not feel wholly different from walking through one in the age of Cleopatra, or even earlier. Children splashed in the Nile, herds grazed in fields, women carried water jars on their heads. Scribes sat in courtyards, recording contracts, while priests measured the floodwaters. The great cities bore marks of Rome, but in the countryside, Egypt endured as it always had, patient and timeless. It is easy to imagine conquest as an ending, a rupture, but often history is less dramatic. It is a blending, a layering, where old and new coexist. Egypt under Rome was not simply a land subdued. It was a land adapting, finding ways to preserve identity even under foreign masters. The pharaohs were gone, but Egypt itself remained, a culture too deep-rooted to be erased, too ancient to be silenced. And so, when you think of Egypt after Cleopatra, you might not picture only Rome's soldiers and governors. You might picture the farmers along the Nile, still whispering prayers to Hapi, the artisans painting faces of the dead with loving care, the priests chanting in temple halls, their voices echoing in stone sanctuaries. And in those small, enduring acts, Egypt survived, not conquered, but continuing, in its own quiet strength. Which leaves us to wonder, was the real power of Egypt ever in its rulers at all? Or was it always in its people, who carried traditions forward long after dynasties and empires had passed away. When Egypt became part of Rome, one might expect its gods to fade into obscurity, confined to their temples along the Nile. And yet, the opposite occurred. Egyptian religion did not wither. Instead, it spread outward, traveling across the empire, carried by merchants, sailors, soldiers, and priests. In time, the gods of Egypt would stand in Rome itself, honored in temples far from the land of their birth. The most enduring of these deities was Isis. She had long been central to Egyptian life, revered as mother, protector, and healer. Her story, as wife of Osiris and mother of Horus, spoke to themes of loss, devotion, and renewal. To Egyptians, she was the one who restored balance when her husband was slain, the one who raised her son to victory, the one who guided souls to the afterlife. When her cult spread into the Greco-Roman world, it carried these qualities with it. In Rome and beyond, Isis became a universal goddess. Her worship promised comfort and salvation, not only to Egyptians but to all who sought her. Sailors prayed to her for safe voyages, women sought her aid in childbirth, and the sick called upon her for healing. Her temples were built not only in Alexandria, but in Athens, Pompeii, and Rome itself. In distant Gaul and even in the northern frontiers of the empire, shrines to Isis stood among forests and rivers unfamiliar to Egyptian eyes. The rituals of Isis adapted as they traveled. Processions honored her with music, incense, and sacred vessels. Priests shaved their heads, dressed in linen, and performed ceremonies at dawn and dusk. The faithful celebrated her festival each spring, reenacting her search for Osiris and her mourning for him. These practices brought color and rhythm to Roman cities, a sense of mystery and renewal that drew crowds of followers. Osiris too traveled, though often intertwined with Greek and Roman deities. In some places, he was linked with Dionysus, god of wine and rebirth. In others, he merged with Pluto, lord of the underworld. His myth of death and resurrection resonated widely, offering hope of life after death. For many, the Egyptian vision of eternity seemed both foreign and familiar, different in its symbols, yet universal in its promise. Serapis, a god created during the Ptolemaic age, also rose in prominence. He had been fashioned as a blend of Greek and Egyptian elements, intended to unite both peoples under one deity. With the features of Zeus and the associations of Osiris, Serapis stood as a bridge between cultures. Under Roman rule, his worship spread further, his great temple in Alexandria serving as a center of devotion. In Rome, the Serapeum became a prominent site, where Romans and foreigners alike gathered in reverence. Other Egyptian symbols found their way into Roman life as well. The ankh, symbol of life, appeared in jewelry. The sistrum, a sacred rattle used in temple rites, was carried in processions. Even the pyramids and obelisks of Egypt fascinated the Romans. They transported several obelisks to Rome, erecting them in public squares. These towering monuments, carved with hieroglyphs, stood as silent witnesses to Egypt's enduring influence. Some still stand today, though their surroundings have changed entirely. Why did Egyptian religion spread so widely? Perhaps because it offered what many in the Roman world sought: mystery, comfort, and personal connection. The state religion of Rome was formal, tied to civic duty and the honor of gods like Jupiter and Mars. But cults like that of Isis provided something more intimate, a promise of protection and salvation that spoke to individuals. In a vast empire where people felt small and vulnerable, these qualities mattered. Yet the spread of Egyptian religion was not without tension. Roman authorities sometimes viewed it with suspicion, fearing secret gatherings and foreign influence. Temples of Isis were occasionally closed, her worship banned for brief periods. But each time her cult returned, stronger than before. By the time of the early empire, her presence was so widespread that emperors themselves could not ignore her. Some quietly tolerated her worship. Others even participated in her rites. In Pompeii, before the eruption of Vesuvius, a temple to Isis stood in the heart of the city. Its walls were painted with images of her mysteries, its altars bearing traces of offerings. When the ash covered Pompeii, the temple was preserved, giving us today a vivid glimpse of her importance. It shows how deeply Egyptian religion had rooted itself in Roman towns, not as an exotic curiosity, but as a living faith. The spread of Egyptian religion also carried Egyptian culture with it. Myths, symbols, and rituals traveled alongside goods and ideas. To worship Isis in Rome was, in some small way, to participate in Egypt's world, to echo the prayers spoken on the banks of the Nile, to feel connected to a civilization far older than Rome itself. And yet, as Egyptian gods spread outward, they changed. They were reshaped by Roman art, Roman language, and Roman ideas. Isis in Rome did not look exactly like Isis in Philae. Her statues showed her in Roman robes, her temples built with Roman arches. But at the core, her essence endured. She remained the protector, the mother, the one who restored what was broken. This blending was not a loss but a transformation. It allowed Egyptian religion to survive in new forms, reaching new peoples, and carrying forward its spirit even as empires shifted. The cult of Isis, in particular, would remain powerful for centuries, lasting even into the early Christian era. And so, as Egypt itself settled into life under Rome, its gods wandered far beyond its borders. They found homes in new lands, new temples, new hearts. The Nile's culture, instead of ending, became global, which leaves us with a thought. Did Cleopatra's death mark the fall of Egypt, or the beginning of its spread? For while its political independence ended, its spiritual influence widened, echoing across the empire. And perhaps, in the end, that influence proved stronger than any kingdom, surviving long after rulers and empires had passed away. When great kingdoms fall, history often tells us of rulers, armies, and battles. But beneath those grand events, ordinary life continues. After Cleopatra's death and Egypt's absorption into Rome, the vast majority of people along the Nile were not queens or generals. They were farmers, scribes, artisans, fishermen, and merchants. Their days were not measured by wars but by work, by family, and by the steady rhythm of the river. To step into Egypt under Roman rule is not to see a land transformed overnight, but to find an old society quietly adapting. The Nile still rose each summer, flooding the fields, bringing the dark silt that gave Egypt its fertility. Villagers gathered along the riverbanks, watching the waters rise, praying for neither too much nor too little. When the floods were generous, harvests were rich, granaries full, and families secure. When the floods failed, hunger followed, and complaints traveled quickly to Roman officials. The farmers who worked these fields lived much as their ancestors had for centuries. Their homes were simple mud brick structures, clustered in villages near the water. Roofs were flat, often used for storage or for sleeping on hot nights. Inside, families gathered around small hearths, women ground grain on stone querns, and children played with clay toys. Furniture was sparse, stools, mats, wooden chests. Life was plain but practical. Food was humble yet sustaining. Bread formed the staple, baked from emmer wheat or barley. Beer, brewed thick and slightly sour, was the common drink, consumed daily. Vegetables such as onions, leeks, and lentils filled the diet, while fish from the Nile provided protein. Meat was rare for peasants, usually reserved for festivals or sacrifices. Dates and figs sweetened meals, while olive oil, imported in large quantities from the Mediterranean, became increasingly common under Roman trade. Clothing, too, reflected continuity and change. Most Egyptians wore linen, woven from flax grown along the river. The heat of the climate demanded light garments. Men wore simple kilts or tunics, women long dresses, often pleated. Roman influence introduced woolen cloaks and shoes, though many villagers still went barefoot. Jewelry, when affordable, was cherished. Beads, amulets, and simple rings, often carrying protective symbols like the Eye of Horus or the Ankh, the sign of life. Religion touched every part of daily existence. Villagers prayed to local gods, brought offerings to small shrines, and participated in festivals. The great temples might have been dominated by priests and ceremonies, but in the countryside, faith was woven into ordinary acts. Farmers prayed to Hapi for the flood, fishermen to Sobuk for the crocodile's mercy, mothers to Isis for the health of children. Under Rome, these traditions continued, even as Roman officials looked on with curiosity or indifference. Taxes, however, were a constant reminder of Roman power. Every farmer owed a portion of grain to the empire, collected by officials and stored in vast granaries. Tax collectors could be strict, even harsh, measuring harvests, recording amounts on papyrus scrolls, demanding payment in kind or in coin. For villagers, the arrival of these officials was often a time of anxiety, as failing to meet obligations could bring fines or punishment. Still, the system was old, and Egyptians were used to supporting distant rulers, whether they sat in Memphis, Alexandria, or Rome. Scribes played an important role in this world. They were the keepers of records, literate in Greek, Demotic, or both. They wrote contracts, recorded taxes, and handled disputes. To hire a scribe was often necessary, for most villagers could not read or write. Papyrus scrolls, produced locally in great quantities, made Egypt a land of documents, where even the humblest agreements were written down and preserved. Many of these survive today, giving us an extraordinary window into daily life. Contracts for marriage, receipts for grain, complaints about neighbors, even petitions to Roman governors. Children grew up learning skills suited to their families. Boys often followed their fathers into farming or crafts, while girls learned weaving, cooking, and household management. Some children, especially in cities, attended schools where they learned to read and write Greek or Latin, to recite poetry, to copy texts. Education was limited but valued, offering a chance for social mobility. In Alexandria, learning reached even higher levels, with scholars studying philosophy, medicine, and astronomy, though such pursuits were far removed from village life. Cities, of course, offered a different rhythm. Alexandria remained the jewel, a cosmopolitan hub where Egyptians mingled with Greeks, Romans, and Jews. Its streets bustled with markets, workshops, and docks filled with ships. Traders sold spices from Arabia, silks from China, glass from Syria, and papyrus from the Nile Delta. Public baths, theaters, and temples marked the urban landscape, echoing Roman styles. Yet even here, Egyptian traditions persisted: statues of Isis, shrines to Serapis, markets filled with familiar foods. Other cities, such as Memphis, Thebes, and Hermopolis, retained importance, though diminished compared to Alexandria. They remained centers of religion and administration, each with its own blend of Egyptian and Roman character. In these towns, one could see Roman soldiers walking alongside Egyptian priests, Latin inscriptions beside hieroglyphs, Roman coinage exchanged for Egyptian grain. Life was not without hardship. Disease was common, especially in crowded towns. Malaria, dysentery, and fevers claimed many lives. Infant mortality was high and average lifespans were short. For most Egyptians, survival meant enduring rather than thriving, working the land, paying taxes, raising children, and seeking the protection of gods. Yet there was joy, too, in festivals, marriages, and family gatherings. Music, played with flutes, drums, and harps, filled celebrations. Dancing and storytelling brought entertainment on long evenings. Festivals tied to the Nile's flood or to local deities offered moments of relief from labor. In such gatherings, life found color and meaning beyond the struggles of survival. In the countryside, Roman authority was distant. A governor in Alexandria, a prefect appointed by the emperor, seemed far removed from the daily concerns of farmers and herders. To villagers, Rome was less an empire than a set of taxes, soldiers, and officials who appeared from time to time. The true rulers of their lives remained the river, the fields, and the gods. Daily life under Rome, then, was not one of dramatic upheaval but of subtle change. The Nile still defined existence. Families still lived in mud-brick homes, ate bread and beer, worshipped Isis and Osiris. But Roman coins circulated, Roman laws shaped contracts, and Roman soldiers patrolled the land. Egypt was both ancient and new, its traditions persisting beneath the weight of empire. And so, as you picture Egypt in this time, do not imagine only palaces and emperors. Picture the farmer watching the floodwaters, anxious for his crops. Picture the mother grinding grain at dawn, baking bread for her family. Picture children chasing each other along dusty lanes, laughing in the sunlight. Picture scribes at their tables, dipping reeds in ink, recording debts and agreements. In these moments, history is not only about rulers and conquests, but about lives lived quietly, day by day. Perhaps this is why Egypt endured so long, why its culture remained even under foreign masters. For it was not the crowns of pharaohs that preserved Egypt, but the resilience of its people, who carried on their lives with patience, adapting without forgetting, surviving without surrendering. And so one must ask, in the great sweep of history, is it the rulers who shape the people, or the people who, by simply continuing, shape the survival of a civilization? To understand Egypt under Roman rule, one must turn to its greatest city, Alexandria. It was not merely a port or a marketplace. It was a crossroads of worlds. Founded centuries earlier by Alexander the Great, the city had always been more Greek than Egyptian. Now, under Rome, it became a bridge between Mediterranean power and the timeless rhythms of the Nile. Picture its harbor first, for that is where the city revealed its soul. Ships from across the known world arrived here, their sails bright against the sea. Grain ships dominated, carrying the harvests of Egypt northward to feed the hungry capital of Rome. Without these shipments, the empire itself would tremble. But alongside the grain came luxury goods. Spices from India, incense from Arabia, silks from the East, and fine glassware from the Levant. The docks were a place of noise and movement. Sailors shouting, merchants haggling, officials inspecting cargo, slaves hauling baskets from ship to shore. Above it all stood the Pharos, the great lighthouse, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Its flame could be seen for miles, guiding ships safely through treacherous waters. For those arriving by sea, it was the first sign of Alexandria, a symbol of both wealth and security. To live in its shadow was to know the power of human engineering, but also the power of empire, for the lighthouse was not just a tool, it was a statement. Moving inland, the city stretched wide, built in a grid of streets, some broad and colonnaded, others narrow and crowded. At its heart lay the Canopic Way, a grand avenue nearly 4 miles long, lined with shops, temples, and statues. Walking along it, you would hear many tongues: Greek, Latin, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic. The air carried the scent of bread baking, incense burning, and fish laid out in markets. The people of Alexandria were as diverse as the goods in its markets. Greeks still held cultural dominance, filling positions of administration and scholarship. Romans brought authority and military presence, their soldiers marching in formation through the streets. Egyptians formed the laboring classes, working in workshops, kitchens, and fields beyond the city. A large Jewish community also thrived, with their own quarter, synagogues, and traditions. Together, these groups made Alexandria a city of coexistence, but also of tension, where identity mattered and boundaries could harden into conflict. The city's intellectual life was no less complex. The great library of Alexandria had long since suffered damage, yet the dream of learning continued. Scholars studied in lecture halls, philosophers debated in colonnades, doctors examined patients with knowledge gathered from Greek texts and Egyptian traditions alike. Astronomy flourished, as the clear skies over Egypt invited study of stars and planets. Mathematics, too, remained strong, with Alexandrian thinkers preserving and expanding upon earlier works. Religion gave Alexandria its unique texture. Egyptian gods remained worshipped, Isis above all, whose cult spread across the Mediterranean. Shrines and processions filled the city with music and offerings, her name invoked by sailors, mothers, and merchants. Alongside these stood Greek temples, dedicated to Zeus, Athena, and Dionysus. The Romans added their own altars and rituals, weaving their gods into the fabric of the city. The Jewish community maintained their synagogues, their sacred texts written on scrolls of parchment, their prayers filling the air on the Sabbath. Later still, Christianity would find fertile ground here, though in Cleopatra's day it was not yet born. Daily life in Alexandria carried a rhythm distinct from the countryside. Families lived in multi-story houses or crowded apartments, their walls plastered with lime, their floors swept clean. Wealthier citizens enjoyed mosaic floors, painted walls, and private courtyards shaded with vines. Slaves performed much of the labor in these households, cooking meals, grinding grain, fetching water from cisterns. The poor lived in tighter quarters, often in single rooms shared by many, their lives closer to survival than comfort. Public life drew people into shared spaces. The theater hosted plays in the Greek tradition, while the hippodrome echoed with the roar of crowds during horse races. Public baths offered not only cleansing but conversation, where merchants, officials, and commoners alike gathered in steam-filled rooms. Markets overflowed with goods, baskets of figs, amphorae of wine, cloth dyed in bright colors, lamps of bronze and clay. Yet Alexandria was not only a place of commerce and leisure, it was also a place of unrest. With its diversity came friction. Greek citizens often looked down upon native Egyptians, while Romans exercised their authority with arrogance. The Jewish community, prosperous yet distinct, sometimes found itself caught in riots fueled by jealousy or prejudice. Tensions simmered, and at times boiled over, requiring Roman garrisons to restore order. Still, the city endured because it was too valuable to fail. Rome depended on its grain. Merchants depended on its harbor. Scholars depended on its schools. Sailors, pilgrims, and travelers passed through its streets, carrying stories and goods across continents. Alexandria's very diversity was its strength and its burden. For the average Alexandrian, life meant navigating these layers. A craftsman might rise early, walking to his workshop, carving wood or shaping metal for trade. A merchant might spend his day at the docks, bargaining over cargoes of wine or papyrus. A mother might take her child to a temple, leaving an offering for health or safety. Students might copy texts by lamplight, their wax tablets filled with lessons in Greek or arithmetic. Soldiers drilled in courtyards, their armor gleaming, their Latin commands echoing in streets once ruled by pharaohs. And always in the background loomed Rome. Governors appointed by the emperor ruled from Alexandria, their palaces adorned with Roman art and symbols of authority. They received petitions, settled disputes, and ensured the steady flow of grain northward. For citizens of the city, Rome was not just an empire. It was the framework of daily life, shaping taxes, laws, and even identity. If one asked an Alexandrian who they were, the answer would depend on where they stood. A Greek might call himself a proud heir of Hellenic tradition, dismissing Egyptian customs as old and rustic. An Egyptian might quietly cling to traditions of ancestors, worshipping gods who had been honored for millennia. A Roman soldier might boast of empire, of law and order brought to this city of contradictions. A Jew might define identity through faith and scripture, distinct from both Greek and Egyptian ways. This mosaic of identities made Alexandria fragile, yet it also gave it brilliance. It was never one thing, never wholly Egyptian, Greek, Roman, or Jewish. It was all of these layered together, shifting like the tide. That was its power and its curse. For Cleopatra, this city had been both throne and prison. It was here she ruled, here she plotted, here she entertained Caesar and Antony. But for the ordinary people of Alexandria, Cleopatra was only one chapter in a long story. Rome came, rulers changed, yet the harbor remained busy, the markets full, the temples alive. Life continued as it always does, shaped by empire but not wholly defined by it. And so, as you imagine Alexandria under Rome, you might wonder, what did it mean to belong here? Was one Alexandrian first and foremost, or Greek, or Roman, or Egyptian, or Jew? Could a city be more than the sum of its parts? Or would it always be divided, a place of brilliance and of fracture? History is not only what happens, it is also what survives in memory. Cleopatra's life ended in Alexandria more than 2,000 years ago, yet her presence has never faded. She became more than a queen, more than a figure in politics. She became a legend, and legends do not belong only to the past, they belong to all who retell them. In her own time, Cleopatra was remembered differently depending on who was doing the remembering. To Romans, She was a symbol of excess and danger, a queen who seduced powerful men and nearly broke their empire. Writers in Rome portrayed her as a temptress, her wealth and ambition threatening Roman virtue. Cicero, who disliked her, described her with disdain, seeing in her nothing but corruption. Octavian, later Augustus, painted her as the foreign woman who bewitched Antony, undermining his loyalty, and in doing so threatened the stability of Rome itself. To Rome, she was the enemy, remembered through the lens of conquest. But in Egypt, the memory was not so hostile. Cleopatra had ruled as Pharaoh, had spoken the Egyptian tongue, had honored the gods of the Nile. She was seen as a continuation of ancient traditions, even if she was of Greek descent. Her image appeared on temple walls, her name inscribed in hieroglyphs, her likeness carved in the old style. To many Egyptians, she was not just a queen but a guardian of continuity, a ruler who honored the ways of the land. For them, her death marked not only the loss of a monarch, but the end of an era, the final time Egypt would be ruled by one of its own sovereigns. Over centuries, the memory of Cleopatra transformed. Historians, poets, and dramatists reshaped her image, sometimes to praise, sometimes to condemn, but always to fascinate. In medieval Arabic writings, she was remembered not as a temptress but as a scholar, a wise queen interested in philosophy, medicine, and alchemy. Legends told of her building monuments, studying the stars, and leaving behind hidden treasures. In Renaissance Europe, Cleopatra became a figure of art and literature. Painters depicted her dramatic death, often surrounded by luxury, with the asp pressed to her breast. Playwrights gave her eloquent speeches, turning her end into theater. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra ensured that her story would echo across English-speaking worlds. His Cleopatra proud, witty, and magnetic, a woman who would not be reduced to the simplicity of defeat. Yet with each retelling, details shifted. Sometimes she was remembered as beautiful beyond compare, though ancient coins suggest a queen with sharp features, more striking than conventionally beautiful. Sometimes she was remembered only through her relationships with Caesar and Antony, as though her power lay only in charm, not in intellect. Other times, she was recalled as a ruler in her own right, a strategist who balanced diplomacy and force in a time of immense danger. Memory has never settled on a single Cleopatra. She is many, depending on who remembers her. The power of her legend lies in its adaptability. To some, she represents the dangers of desire. To others, the strength of female leadership. To yet others, the tragedy of a nation caught between empires. Each generation has found in her story something that speaks to its own concerns. In the 19th century, with colonial powers dominating Egypt, Cleopatra was romanticized as the last defender of Egyptian independence. In the 20th century, as women sought recognition in public life, she was held up as an early example of female authority. Even in modern popular culture, films and novels return to her again and again, reshaping her image for new audiences. But beyond the legends and portrayals, what can we say of the real Cleopatra's legacy? Her rule was brief in the long history of Egypt. Yet she left an imprint that endured because she was both the last of her kind and because she lived at the intersection of worlds. She was the final pharaoh, the last to wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Her death marked the end of a line that stretched back to the dawn of recorded time. In that sense, she is remembered not only for who she was, but for what her passing meant. Cleopatra's story also reveals how fragile memory can be. We know her mostly through Roman sources, the writings of men who despised her, or at least wished to diminish her. The voices of Egyptians who loved her, the voices of her court, of her family, of her people are largely silent. Their papyrus scrolls have been lost, their inscriptions buried or destroyed. What remains is filtered through the lens of conquest. And so, as you listen, you might wonder, how much of what we remember of Cleopatra is truth, and how much is invention? Even today, archaeologists search for her tomb. It has never been found. Legends say she was buried beside Antony, but no one knows where. Some believe she lies within a hidden chamber near Alexandria, others in a temple to Isis farther along the coast. The sands of Egypt keep their secrets, and Cleopatra's resting place remains one of them. Perhaps that mystery itself adds to her power, for to be partly hidden is to invite endless curiosity. Her legacy is not only in monuments or writings, but in the imagination she continues to spark. Few figures in history have been so endlessly reinterpreted. Few have crossed so easily from fact into myth. To think of Cleopatra is to think of the end of pharaohs, the power of the Nile, the meeting of East and West, the uses of love and politics, the line between survival and downfall. And so, as her memory drifts across centuries, one is left with a question. When history and legend become so entangled, can we ever truly know the woman herself? Or must we accept that Cleopatra, like Egypt itself, exists partly in shadow, preserved not in certainty, but in the stories we continue to tell? When Cleopatra died, Egypt entered a new chapter, one without pharaohs. Rome absorbed the land not as an ally, not as a kingdom under client rulers, but as a province, a possession of the empire. The double crown was no longer worn. The ancient rituals of coronation were performed no more. The Nile, however, continued to flow. The people continued to live, farm, trade, worship, and endure. It is here, in the centuries after Cleopatra, that the weight of history shifts. The names of emperors now replaced those of kings on official decrees. Coins bore the faces of Augustus and his successors rather than those of Egyptian rulers. Roman governors ruled from Alexandria, ensuring that the great harvests of the Nile were collected and shipped north. To Rome, Egypt was the empire's granary, a lifeline that fed its swelling population. For the common Egyptian, the rhythms of life were both the same and subtly different. Farmers still rose with the sun, guiding oxen through fertile fields, sowing wheat and barley. Fishermen still cast their nets in the wide river. Craftsmen still carved stone, shaped pottery, and wove linen. But over it all hung the presence of empire. Taxes grew heavier, labor could be demanded, and justice was dispensed in Roman courts. Temples, too, reflected this change. Many were still maintained, their walls covered with hieroglyphs, their sanctuaries filled with offerings. The cult of Isis spread far beyond Egypt, carried to Rome, to Greece, even to distant lands across the Mediterranean. Yet the old gods were gradually overshadowed. Roman deities and later Christian teachings crept in, reshaping the spiritual landscape. The voices of priests grew quieter, the rituals less central. The gods of Egypt, once worshipped for millennia, slowly receded into memory. What of Alexandria, the city that had been Cleopatra's stage? It remained vital. Scholars still studied, merchants still traded, ships still crowded the harbor. But it was no longer the capital of a kingdom. It was a jewel in Rome's crown, a city controlled from afar. Its people lived between worlds, at once Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and eventually Christian. Alexandria endured, but never again would it shine with the political independence it once had under Cleopatra. And yet, history is not only the story of rulers and cities. It is the story of countless lives, most of them unnamed. A farmer in the Fayum, bending over his crops. A potter shaping clay in a village by the Nile. A mother in Memphis grinding grain to feed her children. A scribe copying contracts in a dimly lit workshop. These lives rarely made it into the grand histories, yet they carried Egypt forward. Empires rose and fell above them, but their work sustained continuity. Cleopatra's death marked the end of something far greater than one woman's reign. It marked the end of Egypt as an independent power, the closing of a story that had lasted longer than any other civilization before it. For more than 3,000 years, pharaohs had ruled, dynasties had risen and collapsed, pyramids had been built, temples carved, battles fought, gods honored. With Cleopatra, that line ended. Egypt would never again rule itself in the same way. And yet the land endured. The fields remained fertile, the Nile faithful. The resilience of ordinary people ensured survival. They adapted, as Egyptians always had, to new rulers, new laws, new languages. They carried forward traditions in small ways, in the weaving of linen, the brewing of beer, the telling of stories. History may remember Cleopatra as the last pharaoh, but in truth, the story of Egypt continued in the lives of those who never wore crowns. Today, when we speak of Cleopatra, it is easy to focus only on her loves, her strategies, her death. But perhaps the deeper story lies in what came after, in how a civilization, stripped of its independence, continued through its people, in how memory itself keeps alive what time and conquest sought to erase. As you listen now, you might reflect on how history remembers. Do we remember Cleopatra because she was the last, or because Rome made her story one worth retelling? Do we remember her because she was extraordinary, or because she marks the boundary between the world of pharaohs and the world of empire? And what of the countless lives forgotten? The villagers, the artisans, the children, whose endurance made Egypt's survival possible. Cleopatra's story ends in silence, her tomb unfound, her voice preserved only through those who conquered her. Yet Egypt's story does not end. It lingers in ruins, in papyrus scrolls, in forgotten names, in the long line of humanity that stretches unbroken from her time to ours. And so, as this journey closes, consider this. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Cleopatra is not only the drama of her reign, nor the legend of her death, but the reminder that even when dynasties fall, life continues. The Nile flows, people endure, and history, though it may forget their names, is built upon their quiet strength.